ready? Excellent. Good afternoon. I'm Robert White, council member at large and chair of the Committee on Housing. Today is Tuesday, October 28th, and the time is 12 p.m. And we are meeting in room 500 of the Johnny Wilson Building and on Zoom. I'm calling to order this public hearing on Bill 26-70, the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025, and Bill 2698, the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025. I want to thank everybody for being here today, whether you're testifying, listening, or just trying to understand what's going on in our city. Showing up matters. Today, we're discussing two bills that my council colleagues have introduced in response to resident feedback, and that would significantly impact the district's housing environment if enacted. First, from Councilmember Fruman, the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. Currently, our rent control laws allow owners of rent-stabilized buildings to charge market rent for units occupied by tenants with housing vouchers. A few years ago, the DC Housing Authority started allowing landlords to charge above market rate rent. While the intent was good, incentivizing more landlords throughout the city to admit voucher holders, some saw an opportunity to game the system by pushing out non-voucher tenants. Today, voucher rents are back to market rate because DCHA can better check and enforce rent reasonableness standards. But it's still more lucrative for rent-stabilized building owners to bring in tenants with vouchers versus tenants paying on their own. And while this policy, at least for stabilized buildings, and while this policy has helped house many voucher holders, it has also enticed bad actors, most notably Petra, to do just that. I've heard from constituents in Ward 3 who feel that their landlords neglect them in favor of new neighbors with vouchers. I've heard from constituents in Ward 4 who live in buildings where, according to the Attorney General, the owners have spent years only advertising to people with vouchers, and the property managers report that many residents have unaddressed human services needs. I've also heard about the terrible conditions in many of these buildings and that tenants have little power to fight back. And steering many people with vouchers into few large buildings undermines both the point of voucher programs, letting people of various incomes live interspersed with others, and human services best practices. According to national guidelines for permanent supportive housing and tenant-based voucher programs, having a maximum of 25% of a building leased out to voucher participants is optimal for quote-unquote community integration. I'm also concerned about bad actors exploiting voucher holders for profit while disregarding their safety and well-being. But let me be clear, tenants with vouchers deserve access to safe, stable housing in every neighborhood, in every ward throughout the district. While we work to hold bad actors accountable and close this loophole, we must also condemn discrimination against voucher holders, and we must make room in our city for everyone to thrive. To the stakeholders who have come to testify about this bill, thank you. I look forward to discussing solutions and collaborating with you. And thank you to Councilmember Fruman for introducing this bill. The Committee on Housing had a hearing on an earlier version of this bill a couple years ago, and the version before us today has updates to address concerns that arose then. In addition, some of the context has changed since then, like the rent registry database coming online. So Councilmember Fruman, thank you again for bearing with me and revisiting this important proposal. I'll turn to the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025, introduced by Councilmember Nadeau. Our public transit workers keep the city moving. Every day, they make it possible for residents to get to work, school, and appointments. Their work is essential, and it's excellent. Just last month, WMATA was named Transit Agency of the Year by the American Public Transportation Association, one of the highest honors in the field. WMATA also earned the Global Safety Awards in both 2024 and 2025. These achievements reflect the dedication and professionalism of our transit workforce. Right now, however, these workers don't qualify for the Employer Assisted Housing Program, or EHAP, a program that offers a deferred zero-interest loan and matching grant for down payments and closing costs to eligible district government employees, even if they live in D.C. This bill would fix that. It would make employees who operate or maintain publicly owned transit systems in D.C., including Metrobus, Metro Rail, Metro Access, and D.C. Streetcar, eligible for EHAP. As a performance oversight As of performance oversight season earlier this year, WMATA employs over 13,000 people, 1,600 of whom are district residents. Earlier this year, the Committee on Housing included this proposal in our Budget Support Act recommendations. Unfortunately, it was not included in the final BSA by the Committee of the Whole, but I believe our transit workers deserve the chance to live in the city they serve every day. Over the last 4 fiscal years, demand for the EAP program has been well under the allocated budget. Because of this, the funds will remain accessible to existing eligible applicants should this bill be enacted. We've heard concerns that the bill expands eligibility without increasing the size of the fund and that it could extend benefits to some non-district residents. Over the last 4 fiscal years, EAP has not exhausted its funds and has had an average of $2.3 million in unallocated funds each fiscal year. This should alleviate concerns about making the fund accessible to WMATA employees. Even still, I understand those concerns and I appreciate them. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about ways we can strengthen the bill to address these points while still ensuring WMATA employees have a fair shot at home ownership here in the district, just like our other government employees. And thank you to Councilmember Nadeau for introducing this bill. I don't see any colleagues online. No. All right. So we will move to public witnesses. Before we start hearing testimony, I want to lay out the ground rules for our public witnesses. Everyone should have received a copy of the witness list yesterday. I'll call folks on the list and panels. People who have testified before my committee before know that we use the witness list as a guide, but we also do our best to get everybody's statement, and that means we need to give the staff some flexibility to move folks up or down, particularly as we have some people in person and some people virtual. And then I will work to assemble reasonable panel sizes for witnesses. So please listen closely whenever I'm calling up witnesses, and thank you in advance for your patience and flexibility. When I call your name as part of a witness panel, if you're in the hearing room, please come take a seat at the witness table in front of me. Folks on Zoom, staff will promote you from Zoom attendee to Zoom panelist so that you can testify. You may need to click accept promotion. When you are promoted, you'll drop out of the hearing momentarily and come back into the hearing as a panelist, after which point you'll be able to unmute for your testimony. Public witnesses will have 4 minutes to testify. Advisory neighborhood commissioners testifying in that capacity will have 5 minutes. After that, we will hear from our government witnesses who have 10 minutes to testify. Last note, if you see me and my team looking down during your testimony, it is almost certainly because I am taking notes. We are taking notes, and the team is managing the Zoom part of this hearing. I want you to know that we are listening and not scrolling on Instagram or TikTok, and very much do appreciate your testimony today. So with that, I'll call up our first panel of public witnesses. I believe all these folks are in person. Colin Johnson with the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors, Chair of the Public Policy Committee. Dean Hunter, CEO and founder of the Small Multifamily Owners Association. Amelia Kalma, Director of Housing Policy for the DC Policy Center. And Jacques Chevalier. That's kind of correct. Chevalier from around the way. Jacques Chevalier, welcome to you all. And Colin Johnson, you can begin your testimony. Welcome.
My name is Colin Johnson. I am the current chair of the Greater Capital Area Association's Public Policy. Thank you, Chairman White, for allowing the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors to share our insights regarding Bill 2698, the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025. GCAR represents nearly 11,000 members and are a collaborative voice of real estate professionals, small housing providers, homeowners, and renters that live across the District of Columbia and Montgomery County. Today, we would like to share our strong support of Bill 2698. As you know, the bill would add public transit employees as eligible recipients for the Government Employer Assisted Housing Program. This program seeks to incentivize public service employees to not just work in the district, but also live in the district as well. We understand that our support for this legislation comes at a time of financial uncertainty and concern in Washington, D.C. However, as fears continue to persist that federal workforce in D.C. will decrease, so does the fear that those federal workers will leave the district altogether. To minimize the negative impact of this sudden decrease in population, we must pull out all the stops and make sure that we give people every possible incentive to call DC home. This legislation not only aims to encourage people to live in the district, but it also helps to ensure that our public transit system are fully staffed. Bringing new DC residents while strengthening our transit system is a win-win for DC. As such, we hope that this legislation will receive unanimous support from the council and it will be funded to the fullest extent possible. We appreciate the opportunity to share our association's perspective, and we're eager to answer any questions that the council may have.
Thank you very much. Dean Hunter, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Dean Hunter. I'm the CEO and founder of the Small Multifamily and Rental Owners Association, a trade group representing small housing providers who supply the majority of the district's naturally occurring affordable housing. I'm here to testify in opposition to the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. We will be submitting a formal legal brief to the committee concluding that the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act raises serious constitutional concerns under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution. While we submit the brief, I'll try to summarize the arguments here. If enacted, this legislation would place the district in direct conflict with federal housing law and jeopardize the stability of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The bill seeks to extend rent stabilization notice and enforcement provisions to properties participating in the Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8. That program is governed by 42 U.S.C. Sections 1437F and detailed HUD regulations in 24 CFR Part 982, which already regulate rent setting, lease terms, inspections, and the contractual relationship between landlords, tenants, and the DC Housing Authority. By layering an additional local rent control and penalty regime on top of the existing federal rules, the legislation will create a dual system of regulations that are impossible to reconcile. In constitutional terms, it triggers both field preemption, because HUD already occupies this space, and conflict preemption, because compliance with both legal frameworks would be impossible. If adopted, the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act would make the district the only jurisdiction in the nation to attempt to apply local rent control to federally regulated voucher housing. Even the most heavily regulated housing markets in the country, New York, San Francisco, Boston, expressly exempt federal assistance units from local rent stabilization to avoid conflicting with federal law or risking their housing authorities' HUD contracts. The district should not be the first city in the nation to test this in court. Beyond its constitutional problems, the bill also presents significant fiscal and administrative risk. It would expose the district to litigation under the Supremacy Clause and would place the DC Housing Authority in violation of its annual contributions contracts with HUD. This potentially threatens hundreds of millions of dollars in federal housing funds. It would discourage small landlords from continuing to participate in the voucher program, reducing the supply of affordable housing for low-income residents. This is not an ideological argument, it is a legal and operational one. And before this council acts on a bill that so directly intersects with federal law, the responsible next step is to seek a formal advisory opinion from the Office of the General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD's General Counsel has the authority to clarify whether a local housing law interferes with federal program requirements or with the DC Housing Authority's contractual obligations. Requesting that opinion would provide this council with an independent, authoritative assessment of whether this bill is compatible with federal law and would protect both the city and DCHA from potential legal exposure. Therefore, on behalf of SMOA, I respectfully urge the council to withdraw this legislation pending that legal review and to formally request an advisory opinion from HUD's Office of General Counsel before taking further legislative action. This approach is prudent, responsible, and consistent with our obligation to safeguard public resources and preserve the integrity of the district's housing programs. This bill may be well-intentioned, but it oversteps the district legal authority and threatens to destabilize a federal housing program that tens of thousands of residents depend on. Let's not gamble with federal law or federal funding. Withdraw the bill, request a HUD opinion, and let's work together on a lawful, workable reforms that truly strengthen affordable housing in the District of Columbia. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Amelia Calma, Director of Housing Policy for the DC Policy Center.
Good afternoon, Chairman White, members of the committee, and staff. My name is Amelia Colma. I'm the Director of Housing Policy at the Wilkes Initiative at the DC Policy Center. And I thank you for the opportunity to come and testify today. This change, adding rent stabilization to housing voucher units, would do a couple things I think would be helpful. Namely, rents have not increased for housing vouchers since 2019 effectively, and so it would provide annual predictable rent increases. However, I think in practice, there is not a very good way to actually overlay this with the rent reasonable system. And so I think there are actually several changes that we could make that would be much more helpful than adding rent stabilization. Right now, rent reasonableness is a system that's already in place to prevent excessive rents through the housing choice voucher system. And right now, housing authorities must verify, that the rent is similar to other subsidized units before engaging in any contract. This system exists specifically to ensure taxpayer dollars are not overpaying for rental units and that voucher holders are not charged inflated rents simply because they receive assistance. But between 2019 and 2023, voucher rents were frozen as a policy choice from DCHA, even as operating costs continue to rise with inflation and other expenses. And now that rent reasonableness is put in place, most landlords are still not asking for rent increases, not because their costs are not going up, but because many of these asks for rent increases are actually resulting in decreases in the rent through the rent reasonableness system. So providers are currently fearful that if they ask for a rent increase, the amount they're given through the housing choice voucher process is actually going to go down. So at first glance, making this voucher program subject to rent control might appear to be an improvement because it would allow for these standardized annual rent adjustments under the same formula as rent control, and this would allow predictability that could help property owners better plan for maintenance costs and preserve affordability. However, this provision would be, it could lead to higher costs for housing providers through just administrative and procedural issues. It would increase the administrative burden on DCHA, which already struggles to meet its existing obligations due to limited capacity. It would lead to regulatory conflict, and it would give the wrong participation incentives to housing providers. Right now, there are serious issues with the housing voucher process that could be addressed to improve access and use to housing voucher tenants. We should improve the lease up and inspection process and remove bottlenecks that delay units from getting leased and occupied. Right now, it takes 2 months to get a tenant leased during the housing voucher process, and then another 2 months approximately to get them to move into the building. That's 4 months where units are sitting empty and housing vouchers are not having access to those units. Then it takes approximately 2 to 9 months for a housing provider to receive money from the government to get paid. Right now, these are serious bottlenecks that should be improved to increase voucher occupancy and use and allow providers to actually use this system. Furthermore, the rent reasonable system is a black box. So when housing providers don't know whether or not their rent is going to be approved under the voucher system. This means that tenants are applying for units and sending in application fees for units that they don't actually qualify for. And it means that providers are spending weeks trying to negotiate with DCHA and appeal these processes. Thank you. We should increase transparency in these rent reasonableness decisions, and this would make the process easier for everybody and allow for better housing for tenants and better use by providers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques Chevalier.
Thank you, Thank you, Councilmember White, for pronouncing my name correctly, even though it took me to 7th grade to get it. However, again, my name is Jacques Chevalier. I own a property over in Gainesville Street Southeast in Ward 8, PSA 702. I mention that because I'm very familiar with having to call the police, unfortunately. on tenants. However, having served DC residents as a landlord since September 30th, 1985, 40 long years, it has always given me pride in most instances to assist Black tenants. Being a Black man myself, born here in DC, married to a Black woman, producing 2 children in our union, our hope is to leave assets to them to continue wealth building. In opposition to Bills 25-0227 and B 26-0070, Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025, many reasons make this bill an immobilization of finances, limited housing for low-income families in the district, lowering of property values affecting assessment revenue for this city. Assault and insult to 100 of small landlords like myself with one property, a small 8-unit building, having endured the worst economic years in the history of housing in DC. I have 4 tenants who are under the voucher program, I have 4 tenants who pay market rent. So I'm split even. Small landlords provide for residents that are underserved, bad credit, mentally challenged, ex-convicts. I'm an ex-convict, by the way. I got out in 1974. Domestic violence victims, eviction prone, destructive to our units again and again during my 40 years in this profession. Only one housing code violation since ownership, and that makes me proud because, in fact, I earn enough profit to sustain my business. Though I have had several individual tenants cause thousands of dollars in damages, quit their jobs to avoid judgments and garnishing of wages, the city, shields them like the Iron Dome in Israel. To now tie voucher rents to the restricted, outdated rent control ceilings are unjust and unfaithful to the very dedicated landlords seeking to make a small profit. Historically, no other businesses or profession gets slaughtered mercilessly by the DC City Council like a small landlord business owner routinely with these insensitive, restrictive regulations inhibiting a fair return of profit. Pleading with the full council to reject this sadistic gutting of our finances and request Member Fruman to quit his fuming. I hope you like that little rhyme. Be landlord human and quit destroying housing supply in my birthplace and especially Black folks here in this city. It is tough for us. I'm going to use up my full minute left. I've tried very, very hard to always be a good landlord, to be responsible. I drive a family man Hyundai. I'm not driving a Mercedes or Rolls Royce like some of you guys on the panel here, you know. I don't have a maid. I don't have a chef. My wife doesn't cook but 3 times a year. You know, so I know I'm going off the rocket here, but I'm just saying I'm a regular guy. I'm a landlord, you know, but I'm not, you know, making millions and millions of dollars. I pull in a decent salary, and my tenants to pay market rent, by the way, I have not raised their rents in approximately 7 years. And you can check DC HD, I believe is that agency, and it'll show. I haven't raised the rents in my market rent because they're good tenants, they pay, and I'm trying to keep them there. And we know that a good tenant is worth their weight in gold, unlike some of you all serving this council. I know that was terrible. It's a low blow.
It's a low blow. I was gonna let the Mercedes go and
Councilmember White and Fruman and Councilmember George, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us. Let the record reflect that I drive an old Volkswagen Dadmobile. Councilmember Fruman, who is a member of this committee, I'll turn to you first. If you have an opening statement, we'll give you additional time.
Okay, you got me flat-footed. All right, thank you very much for everybody who's come out to testify. I look forward to what will be, I suspect, an eventful hearing as witnessed by this first panel. Thank you for your testimony. Let me talk a little bit about where this bill comes from. And there are 2 things that led me to want to do this legislation. One is at the time that we did this, it was actually before the changes to the rent reasonableness standard, where the district was radically overpaying market levels for voucher tenants, and it created an incentive for high concentrations of voucher tenants in certain buildings. And that could work to the detriment of others who would have liked to have been in those rent stabilized buildings. So you had one form of affordable housing cannibalizing another form of affordable housing. It also led to the kinds of densities that Chairman White talked about that you really don't want to see in this space, that don't make sense. And so you had a system that wasn't working in the way that I think everybody thinks it needs to work. You also, when you're way overpaying, those dollars are finite, and that means you can serve fewer people. So if we're paying twice as much in rents, and I'm not saying it's twice as much today, if we're paying twice as much for rents in rent stabilized buildings than we should, in my opinion, that would be fair, in my opinion, then you can only do half as many vouchers. And so you have all those people who are on the waiting list trying to get housing who also are adversely affected by this. Now, we put forward this legislation. It actually got a lot of support right out of the box. And then we heard from various landlords about their concerns of what the impact would be on them. And we tried between the first version of this bill and the second version of the bill to get at the concerns that were raised. And I'm going to turn to questions in a moment. We thought we had gotten there in important ways, but maybe there's more that we can learn through this hearing process so that we can make it work. But I do think that as stewards of public dollars, we have to be careful to spend them efficiently. And we have to be careful about incentive structures that get created. One thing that some of the critics of the bill raise is that could it create an incentive structure that discouraged landlords from renting to potential voucher tenants? And we don't want to create a disincentive in that direction, but we also don't want to have an incentive for landlords, and we've seen a recent lawsuit about this, to rent only to voucher tenants and then thereby to cannibalize a different segment of affordable housing. So there is a balance that needs to be struck in this place. I think that this legislation gets at that balance. A number of people today are going to tell me, great job. It does. A number of people are going to tell me, no, it doesn't. For the ones who tell me, no, it doesn't, I really want to hear how we address it and strike the appropriate balance, because I don't think that we have been in a place where we've had the appropriate balance. So, and Mr. Hunter, you and I have, we agree on some things, we disagree on other things. You always express yourself forcefully. I'm grateful for that. I heard your testimony. This morning has been bumpy, but I heard the opening statements and all of the different testimony. I'll be curious to see the brief that you're talking about. My understanding is that under federal law, it is a choice where there is a rent stabilization system, whether or not rent reasonableness employs it or does not employ it, and that's explicitly delegated to the jurisdiction. But we'll see the brief that you're going to submit, and I will promise you I will read it with interest. Mr. Chevalier, did I get it right? Or oh, good. And I apologize. Something ran late. I had people in my lobby. Here we are. And we can have more conversations after this. But yours is an interesting setting. I didn't, that you have 8 units, 4 of them pay market rent, and 4 of them are paid by the city through. If you're comfortable, can you describe how those rents differ?
How they get approved?
No, what the numbers are. Is the market rent folks, are they paying more or are they paying less than the voucher
Well,
rents?
actually, I'm licensed for 4 single rooms and 4 apartments. The 4 apartments, for a while, to be honest, I did not and would not rent to voucher holders, no matter what the rent was, like a lot of landlords. And I'll admit that because I've been having voucher holders now for several years, and it's probably the statute of limitations can't come after me. But
I was going to
You know-
encourage you not to admit that, but
yeah, I understand, but I'm just saying a lot of us did. We said, no, we're not touching them because a lot comes with having to rent to people who they get evicted by me and they turn right around and go back to the housing department and you turn around and you give them another voucher. And they go and they burn and skunk another landlord over and over again. Nobody seems to want to address that. So my tenants that pay the market rent for rooms, I'm licensed for both. And I say that with emphasis because a lot of rooms are done illegally in this city. And I just try to be fair and I offer a lot. I keep properties in pristine condition. Even the condominiums on my street, the people tell me on Gainesville that my property look better than the condominiums because I care. And so I haven't made a whole lot of money. And the other thing is this, Councilmember Fruman, at one time across the city, depending on the area, you could have the same amount of square footage, the same amenities, and they have, I think it's like 40-something, 50-something different neighborhoods in DC. Can't remember off the top of my head now. And depending on where your property was, that also predicted what the rate would be. And so I can have my building in Southeast, I get $2,100 for a 3-bedroom. You take that same 3-bedroom, you go up on Capitol Hill, Forest Heights, Colonial Village, and they get $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for it. And that to me is something that should have been addressed more so than just punishing me because I happen to board a property in Southeast. So that's the other thing that's hurting me. We were over in Southeast, we were already getting the lowest rents possible.
well,
I'm sorry if I
no, that's super helpful. And I hear you on that. And it used to be that it was 47 different areas. Now it's the rent reasonableness test looks at the rents in the area and comes up with what based on the other rents in the area. So you're right that it, by definition, in places in lower income neighborhoods, the rents are going to be
we weren't
lower.
discriminated against heavily.
So, but did you say you get $2,100 for a 3-bedroom apartment?
Yes, sir, plus utilities.
From the housing
Housing.
authority?
Right.
And that it's
That's-
not comparable, that the other rooms that are market rooms are rooms, not 3-bedroom
Right,
apartments.
so they're not comps. I used to be a real estate broker as well as a loan officer and an appraiser. So you're right, they're not comparable, so they're not the same. My rooms, I get like $650 a month.
And, okay, and so, and $650 a month if it's a 3-bedroom apartment and 3 people, 3 rooms.
No, these are single rooms.
The single rooms, though, I'm saying 3 of them would be getting you close to $2,100.
That's correct.
But what do you think you would get under a rent stabilized framework? How different would that be from your $2,100?
And let me explain something. And I did get a little clarification from your legislative aide, and I forget his name, forgive me. I think it was
Kevin.
Kevin, that's all right. Kevin back there. But yeah, he gave me a little better understanding that I haven't raised my rents under the rent control because of getting the voucher rents. I haven't did the rent control forms in probably 6 or 7 years, maybe longer than that. But he explained to me that one of the part of your act would be, the amendment would be to have us calculate all those years that we never raised the rent. So maybe it may come up close to what I'm getting now. But of course, those increases only been like 1%, 2%, in the past, it hasn't been that high.
I mean, I do think.
We're a bit over time.
Okay, but can I just close this out and then, I do think we're going to talk again, and I'd like to have you look at it because I do think I'll be curious how close it is and if it is potentially higher. And also, I would say the witness next to you testified about the predictability that comes. I'm not sure what the economic impact would be on you. I do not want to have an adverse economic impact on you, but let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Lewis George, we have members on a 7-minute clock, but if you have an opening statement, we're happy to add.
I do.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Councilmember White, for holding this hearing, and to my colleague, Councilmember Fruman and his staff, for introducing, reintroducing, and really working to find balance within the rent, through the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act. I want to begin by recognizing that this issue, the legislation is seeking to address, is very complex and difficult to solve. But far too many residents are suffering because of the ways housing vouchers have been misused in our housing market. I've heard too many stories personally of long-term residents who relied on rent control being displaced so a landlord could collect higher voucher rents. And I've seen too many developers present themselves as sort of affordable housing providers with affiliated social service nonprofits, when in reality, they are targeting vulnerable residents only to abandon them to rapidly deteriorating conditions, poor property management, and little to no support. These residents are being exploited for their high value vouchers, and I think this is a practice that must end. The consequences of this exploitation are far reaching. Beyond the neighbors living next to neglected properties and the long-term residents forced from their homes, voucher speculation has also driven up property values in older rent-controlled buildings. This, in turn, has made TOPA less effective as developers seeking to genuinely preserve affordable housing are outbid by those using this exploitative model. This cycle has repeated itself across Ward 4 and throughout the district, and we have to do something to stop it. At the same time, I'm also deeply concerned about the district's ability to confront source of income discrimination. These higher voucher rents were initially put in to ensure that vouchers holders truly had a choice in where they lived. Today, I'm hoping to hear solutions and ideas for how we can strengthen enforcement and accountability to combat source of income discrimination so that every resident has a fair opportunity to live in the neighborhood of their choosing. I know that many residents who are using housing vouchers will face real challenges because of our deeply inequitable and often racist housing market, but something has to be done. Far too many residents have been displaced by the predatory practices of those profiting from this broken system, and our residents deserve better. I'm grateful to everyone who has shown up today to testify on these complex and interconnected issues. This legislation was raised, I think, in Ward 3 and Ward 4. We have particularly seen this happening, and we've heard from our residents a real far out cry to find a way to fix this system. And so that is the challenge that we are presented today, understanding how complex this is, understanding how interconnected this is. I do have some questions for this panel. First off, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for testifying about the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act. I don't have questions for you all today, but I appreciate you taking the time to be here and make your support known. Mr. Hunter, you've asked for, I think, the DCHA opinion. I guess they will be testifying later. What is your specific legal question for them?
The actual ask is for HUD to issue a legal opinion
Okay,
on the appropriateness of this legislation. It's our position that it conflicts with federal law.
understood. Okay, thank you. Ms. Kalma, did I say that right? You talked about rent reasonableness in your testimony. Can you speak to how it is that reasonableness is determined by DCHA and your understanding of that?
So my understanding is that a housing provider will submit their unit and the details about it through affordablehousing.com, and they will submit back like a yes or a no on whether or not like the rent is reasonable or not. There's no information beyond that. It is truly like an approval or a denial. You can then appeal that process by submitting like 3 comparable units. But my understanding right now is that when rent reasonableness was implemented, it added a minimum of 2 weeks to lease up time. Because if you don't get your information, your request in by the 5th, you cannot get a tenant leased up by the next 1st. And then more time is added by appeals.
Got it.
And so I think it would be very helpful to have just more transparency around how these rent reasonableness decisions are made so that, again, housing providers and tenants can get better matched up and leased up much more quickly and get into these units. And I think also it would be possible to say publish what reasonable rent is by neighborhood or census block and unit size and other characteristics to lead to better predictability, again, for tenants who are trying to find an apartment
Right.
and make sure it qualifies, and for providers to just get people into these units.
What factors do you think should be considered in ensuring that a voucher is not paying more than it should?
I mean, I think the comparable units is a very reasonable thing to do. There's a system in place that housing providers use for LIHTC and other systems where they submit, their information about the unit and they submit their comparable units. And I think you could just use that same system that we use for LIHTC for housing choice vouchers.
Got it. Considering how challenging rent reasonableness levels are to predict, couldn't rent stabilization of voucher units make rent levels easier to predict and therefore future financing easier to obtain?
I think potentially, yes. It would be helpful to have more predictable rents. It would be really helpful to have these predictable standardized rent increases, which again, there just haven't been real increases since 2019. And now a lot of providers aren't asking for increases because a lot of the determinations have come back with just less money than even DCHA is paying right now. And so I think potentially having that predictability would be really helpful, but it all comes down to the implementation and not
Understood.
adding time and
Got
other
it.
delays into this lease up process.
Understood. Mr. Hunter, it looked like you wanted to also respond to this.
Yes, Councilmember. I want to say that frankly, rent reasonableness has become unreasonable. I believe that the agency, in response to political pressure, in response to pressure from the media, is bending over backwards to, like she said, discount rents. It not only happens when a person applies with the initial tenant, there's also a process now where they're reviewing the lease in the middle of the term and making a determination that, hey, we're paying you too much and we're reducing your rent in the middle of the lease term. So, I hear you on pushing to ensure we're not overpaying, but the reality of the matter is we submit in some instances we are underpaying. And it's very unfair and hard to run a business where you reach an agreement on a rent and then all of a sudden in the middle of the term, the agency comes in and flips on you and there's nothing you can do.
Understood. Mr. Chevalier, thank you for sharing your perspective on Chevalier from around the way. Chevalier from around the way. Now I'm going to remember. I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing your perspective, truly. You're clearly devoted decades to maintaining safe, quality housing for DC residents, and I think that experience is invaluable. I think supporters of this legislation believe it's designed to prevent exploitation and keep affordable housing, for low-income families. From your perspective, what parts of the bill could be strengthened or clarified to better support responsible small landlords like yourself while still protecting vulnerable tenants from exploitive practices of sort of corporate bad actors who have been cheating the system?
Again, I will point to the fact that we're over in Southeast, we've gotten ridiculously lower rents for decades, whether it was through the housing choice voucher or through the markets, through regular market rent. And so I think that just like you say, you've had this exploitations going on in Ward 3 and 4. We've had the opposite effect where it has been really hurting us. And I think some parts of Ward 7 and 8 ought to have maybe some kind of exemption or some kind of extra bonus to have us come up to a reasonable profit. And I'm willing to open my books up, which they aren't that long because, I ain't getting that much money, excuse my bad English. But I just think that there has to be some kind of way to look at those of us who have already, over the years, have gotten more rents because of where we were located.
Understood. Awesome. Thank you to this panel. Thank you, Chairman White.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis George. Councilmember Trayon White.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. I do want to say this, that Ward 8 is overwhelmingly a community of renters. And rent stabilization apartments are the backbone of families east of Anacostia River and some areas west of Anacostia River. In Ward 8, roughly 4 out of 5 homes are rental and thousands are rent controlled, including large shared family unit sizes that our residents depend upon. While rent stabilized units function as intended, they keep families housed, kids in their schools, and seniors in their neighborhoods. We know that in general, DC is simply becoming too unaffordable. We've seen how a loophole can undermine these protections. Some landlords have treated rent controlled buildings like voucher only buildings, advertising and leasing them at higher subsidy rates instead of regulated rent control levels. Just last week, the city reached a $700,000 settlement with a landlord accused of using deceptive practices, profiting off of higher voucher and reimbursements while blocking access for non-voucher renters who still need affordable homes. That's not how rent stabilization is supposed to work. This legislation is designed to close a loophole, and it also removes the exemption for units rented with tenant-based subsidies. Bars any agreement that would waive rent stabilization requirements and require subsidy administrators to verify that any rent increases comply with rent stabilization before paying. This is an opportunity to protect affordability, stop gamesmanship, and also keep DC residents in stabilized housing. And I'm big on home ownership, so we have to counter that narrative and also have a balance to how we can get more people owning homes and make sure we can get these units fixed up. And part of what we want to do is one is prevent exploitation and keep affordable housing in the city. And I think that we anticipate and build for new people coming to DC, but there's a population of DC residents been here in the long haul, want to stay here and grow their families here. And so I'll pause there. I did want to ask Mr. Chevalier, am I saying it right?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
I've seen you over the years and I know your advocacy, and I appreciate what you do to help keep residents in their homes. And I agree that I agree that we have to find the right balance to compare the rents for Ward 8 as far as those across the city. But you said you want to move to a reasonable profit. Can you explain what that may look like in general?
Well, a reasonable profit, it enables us to be able to maintain the property, keep it up, provide the best amenities and value to the property, as well as, I don't know if I can really put a percentage on it, Councilmember White, but I think that, we'll do a reasonable rate of return on our investment. And certainly someone like myself who's been doing this for 40 years, I get calls every other day of people trying to get me to sell my property. I don't want to sell because I want to continue, to be honest, to help out Black people, to continue to, I've only had one Caucasian tenant in 40 years, by the way, not because of discrimination, but because of where I'm located. And so I think that I don't know, 10 to 20%, is a reasonable profit after expenses, after your mortgage. The mortgages, as you know, have gone sky high. We're not getting the proper value. As you know, there's been cases of appraisers who are lowballed Black homeowners as well as Black apartment owners. And so we end up getting less money when we try to refinance or buy a property, a lot of times being a Black landlord. So I don't really have a figure for you, but I think that, probably 10, 20, 25% is a reasonable rate of return on your money after expenses.
Thank you. And just as I remember a while back to the chairman, Robert White, for this committee, in reference to HUD's new mandate on rents in the District of Columbia. And then there was a series, there was a time where uh, residents were told they were going to get this amount of money for this particular type of unit, this square footage, this unit amount in this area. And once approved, HUD changed and left the tenant in a debacle where he or she left their current residence to move into a new place and was stuck because the new rent didn't match what they could afford at the particular place. And so I don't know if we have found a happy medium to that. But it's my hope that we continue to chip away at this to make DC more equitable, and also help people to earn more higher incomes, because we are concerned that as the eviction rates picks up, we don't know what's going to happen federally either, that residents can get displaced and it's harder to rehouse a person or a family than to keep them where they are. And this is off the topic, but it's also related. Been in discussing with Department of Human Services, and their emergency rental assistance program is not what it used to be. And coming up is not what it's not going to serve the purpose of what it was intended to serve. And so I'm deeply concerned about those residents who have been here in the long haul, want to stay here, and particularly for our senior citizens, which is a growing population in the city. And we're seeing an influx of those who are seniors moving east of the Anacostia River. Where can they go? Where can they stay? And where can they afford to live? That's clean, safe, and just a good environment for our residents that's been here in the long haul. So I'll digress with this. I want to thank the other panelists for joining us today, my other colleagues who are here today, and I'll give it back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Trayon White. Um, Colin Johnson, thank you very much for your testimony. I don't have any issues with this bill at this point, and I haven't heard any, so I'm not gonna mess that up. 'Cause the other bill got enough issues we got to work through. So the Housing Committee is like therapy, and there's always a lot to unpack, and we talk about everything in the world, and we kind of get stuck in these generalizations. So we're gonna work through our trauma, and we're gonna sort this stuff out. Right now, we're talking about one bill, though, right? Not like all landlords, not all small landlords, not all renters. We're talking about one bill. There is an issue here, right? There are some landlords who have over-concentrated their buildings entirely or almost entirely with people who have high needs, who have vouchers. That has caused serious issues that have come to us. They are real issues that any of us would be sensitive to. We're hearing it from various wards. The wards I hear about it most from are Ward 3 and Ward 4. We can't not do anything. And so the question is, unless you disagree with the premise that this is not a problem anywhere in the city, then the question is, what do we do to prevent landlords from intentionally going after people who have high needs that these landlords are not prepared to meet their needs because they pay higher rents, and they only pay higher rents because of this law? What do we do there if not Councilmember Fruman's bill? Dean Hunter.
Councilmember, that is the crux of the problem. And let me say a couple of things. Number one, we saw this problem arise, this business model really explode during the pandemic. Because people had a moratorium on evictions and rent payments, some business and entrepreneur people saw this as an opportunity to continue to get rents during the pandemic. So we saw the proliferation of this new all voucher model take place. And the fact of the matter is, before rent reasonableness, we did have an issue with some people being overpaid, but we have addressed that now. I submit that market forces and others are going to see this correct itself. Number one, you brought back voluntary agreements. That was a very important tool as it relates to the ability of a housing provider to sell their building, negotiate with the tenants who are there about what's going to be market and what's not going to be market. So I think to the extent that these buildings are now being sold, there's a possibility that we're going to see the client mix change. The second thing, which is I don't have the answer to, which is very important. I mean, we're liberals, right? And we really want to see the proliferation of affordable housing. And actually, that's what this has done. It has proliferated affordable housing. And there have been some adverse consequences to it. It's a very, how can we say on one hand, we want to get as much affordable housing as possible? Here we have individuals creating affordable communities. I submit it speaks to rent control. Because if that rent ceiling on that rent control building wasn't as low as it was, then that owner would be able to renovate their building and attract people at the higher market rates to their building also. So I think we need to look at all of this, how rent control, in fact, impacts the inability of people in Ward 7 and 8 to improve their properties, to get tenants to want to live there and pay higher rents. Similarly, I think that this is a problem that has been resolved with rent reasonableness. and the incorporation of involuntary agreements, and we're going to see this take care of itself.
Amelia Calma, you mentioned a number of things in your testimony, and you gave recommendations that would go to voucher occupancy, which is not the problem that Councilmember Fruman's bill is trying to address. So like the lease ups and inspection process, that stuff is, you're right about that, but that's not the issue his bill is trying to address. So what's your recommendation to address that issue? If not Councilmember Fruman's bill, how do we address this issue with, I mean, seeing a lot of problems concentrated in some buildings?
I mean, I think you could put a limit on the amount, like say the percentage of voucher holders in a building. If your issue is with over concentration, then maybe after say 25% or, whatever you deem is reasonable, you stop approving vouchers for that building. I think that there's other ways to go about that over concentration problem. I do also think that if you fix some of the delays in occupancy and the lease up and the move-in process, that voucher rents could go down, that I think there are some incentives for landlords to increase the amount of rent that they need from a voucher unit because these units sit empty initially for at least 4 months. And so I think if you fix some of these administrative burdens, that you could also see some of that overpayment go away. And I agree that the rent reasonableness system will also help address that. And finally, I think you could increase capacity at DCHA to review rent reasonableness asks and ensure compliance with the current laws. And I think that that would help address this current payment problem as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chevalier, I heard a lot of your concerns, very much understand and agree with many of them. What are so this bill passing or not passing isn't going to change the market rent or voucher rent for your building. What's your problem specifically or concern specifically with this bill?
I think it would change the rents that I'm able to collect because, again, I haven't taken the rent increases for, I'm thinking roughly 7 years for any of my tenants. And so whether they pay in the market rent or the voucher holders, I know that I could do that yearly, but like a lot of landlords, we just felt when no need to. If I had and almost, again, a small building, I would hope that somehow or another that the rents could be adjusted, especially again, and I'm pounding on this, because we were already getting the lowest rents in the city because the neighborhood I'm in, Randall Highlands. That would be my solution to it. I'm not going to get, even after those increases are adjusted in from the rent control factors, rent control allowances over the years, I don't think that it's going to equal up to what I'm getting now because the rent control has been so low.
If you got less from the tenants with vouchers, do you think you would have to raise rents on the tenants that don't have vouchers?
I probably would, and that's something I really, really am reluctant to want to do because these are all older gentlemen that rent from these rooms from me, and I probably would have to do it, and that's something I really don't want to do.
I appreciate it. Well, let me move to the next panel. I want to thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, council members.
You hit the microphone. Just
Under the solution, council member, if I could, if we could convene a work group where we worked on this in a proactive manner versus in a defensive manner, where we pull all the people together, look at how it's done in other jurisdictions, look at what is the root of the problem, bringing the various stakeholders, we can probably come up with a solution. Part of the problem with our housing policy is that housing providers find ourselves under attack, and responding. It limits our ability to be proactive. I would submit that is the way we approach this, that we cautiously get together and work collectively, look at what's done in other jurisdictions, and then come up with a solution we could agree with.
I appreciate it. I will say this, though, there is an issue, right? And the sense I get is that landlords, particularly small landlords, feel like they're constantly under attack. I don't like that. We also can't do nothing, right? When these residents are coming saying, look at what's happening day after day, year after year, it's putting people in danger. We can't do nothing. And this bill has been sitting around for a couple of years now. And so we've got a little bit of time to offer solutions or amendments.
Mr. Chairman, can I just chime in for 1 second? So thank you very much, Mr. Hunter, for that suggestion. After we had the hearing on the bill the first time, we actually tried to do that. And I thought that we had made significant progress, but doesn't mean that you can't do it again. So Mr. Chevalier, I really want to get together with you. I actually do want to see your books and as part of the conversation. And Mr. Hunter would love to sit with you to talk about how do we make this work? Because some of the challenges that you're talking about, the big picture in the housing space, I hear you. On rent reasonableness, HUD said it's a problem, you're not doing a rent reasonableness test, and now we are, and the ripple effects of that are significant for lots of people, but that's not just a decision we made, that was a decision that the feds imposed on us. But let's work together going forward. That's my main thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Brian Weavell, Director of Special Projects for ATU Local 689. Catalin Peter, Vice President for AOBA. Artemis Eden, Public Witness. All right. Are there, no, we'll go there. Okay. Brian, you can begin your testimony. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Chair White and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025 would help WMATA's transit workers live in the city that they help move every day. It's really that simple. The Employer Assisted Housing Program is a successful program that helps DC's essential workers continue to live in the District of Columbia by providing grants for down payment assistance. As home prices have skyrocketed, the amount that a working person might be expected to pay upfront just to get into their first home has ballooned at the same pace. By targeting down payment assistance, the District of Columbia can use their money to efficiently get workers into homes in the district. The current rules of the program set reasonable guardrails to ensure that the workers use their home as their primary residence and stay employed with the employer for at least 5 years. This means the District of Columbia gets a strong tax base, recapturing even more of the money that the district has invested into the public transit system. And transit employers get employees with an eye towards staying at their job for longer periods of time. There was a time when a program like this would not have been necessary. Our union is over a century old. Back then, it was almost impossible not to live near where you worked. But over time, personal automobiles allowed for longer and longer commute times. But for decades, our membership was firmly rooted in DC, well after the mass adoption of the automobile. So what changed? Housing prices shot through the roof. And for the last few decades, we have seen our membership numbers concretely shift from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. First, our membership moved to Prince George's, and now we're seeing similar patterns repeat again as the membership moves south to Charles County. This was not because WMATA moved its physical infrastructure. The district is still the primary work location for thousands of bus and rail workers at Brentwood Rail Yard, Bladensburg Bus Division, Shepherd Parkway Bus Division, Western Bus Division, and Northern Bus Division, which is currently closed pending renovations. Even this list fails to include the massive number of rail stations in DC or bus lines. This movement of transit workers was not because of consumer preferences. This wasn't about picket fences and yards in the suburbs. The District of Columbia has a varied housing stock with neighborhoods that could meet almost anyone's preferences. This was a financial decision. The median sale price of a home in Washington, D.C. is nearly $665,333, according to Zillow data accurate as of August. This is almost double the national average. Compare this to Prince George's County with a median sales price of $420,000, or Charles County, where the median sales price was $440,000. We are very proud of the wage and benefit package that our WMATA members receive. It is the result of over 100 years of struggle and organizing. But those hourly wages are just numbers scribbled on a piece of paper if they do not actually afford you the ability to purchase the type of life that you worked so hard for. On a different note, it's worth discussing how addressing workforce housing issues might be the way that WMATA can stand out as an employer as the industry faces workforce recruitment and retention challenges over the next decade or two. Transit has been facing a nationwide CDL shortage for almost 10 years now. Due to the stress of the work, many bus operators leave after just a few years. The median age of a bus operator in 2022 was 53. The median age of a generic worker in America is 42. That means that there's likely to be a massive turnover and disruption in the industry over the next decade. Thousands of workers will need to be hired, trained, retained just to keep the system alive, not to mention expand to meet the needs of tomorrow. Nearly 3,000 current WMATA workers will hit retirement eligibility over the next 10 years. What may set WMATA apart from other transit employers is its ability to give workers a slice of the old dream that you can work a fulfilling, meaningful job that actually helps people with solid union negotiated wages and benefits, and that you can own your own home. WMATA and DC have a chance to make that vision a reality again. It will be something that other employers might not be able to compete with, and as a result, WMATA can continue to attract the best and brightest. For the sake of maximally recapturing the investment that DC puts into WMATA, for the sake of fairness that a worker should be able to live where they work, and for the sake of setting WMATA up for future success as workforce recruitment and retention challenges grow, we urge the DC Council to pass the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025. And with that, I would just say I did some rough napkin math and figured out that the amount of time it would take for someone to actually repay in property tax, state income tax, and sales tax, the district would recoup its money in basically 2 years, so long as someone is paying into all of those. So with that being said, I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much. Catalin Peter, Deoba, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair White and members of the committee. To make my mother proud, who is watching this after 12 years, I will pronounce my own name correctly. My name is Peter Kotalin, and I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan DC. I am here today to testify in respectful opposition to the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. I want to begin by recognizing Councilmember Fruman's engagement on this issue and the thoughtful revisions reflected in this new draft. The 2025 version meaningfully improves on the 2023 proposal, particularly around notice, reporting, and clarifying the roles of subsidy administrators. Those changes demonstrate real responsiveness to feedback from both tenants and housing providers. That said, we do continue to have deep concerns about the practical impact of this bill on the availability of housing for voucher holders and on the administrative systems that keep those programs functioning. Rent stabilization and the rent stabilization and the voucher program each serve important but distinct roles. Rent stabilization protects tenants in the private market by setting predictable rent limits. Voucher programs rely on negotiated rents and federal guidelines to make units accessible and to keep landlords participating. When we blend those two frameworks, as this bill proposes, we do risk creating a structure where no one is quite sure which set of rules governs a given tenancy. And I believe that this is what Dean was talking towards earlier. That uncertainty can discourage participation, particularly among smaller housing providers who don't have compliance staff or legal resources to navigate multiple overlapping systems. The intent to ensure fair, lawful rents is sound, but the reality that the rent reasonableness process is already quite stringent and in some cases overly conservative. As a result, approved rents can come in much lower than anticipated, and the overall lease-up process can take weeks or even months, as we've heard from colleagues. Adding new verification and notice steps tied to rent stabilization could lengthen that timeline even further. For voucher holders searching for housing in a tight market, every additional layer of review means one more barrier to actually leasing up. For providers, it can mean another month or two without payment on a unit that they've set aside in good faith. The risk, then, is that well-intended reform makes participation less feasible. If owners conclude that taking a voucher tenant now means dual compliance obligations, slower processing, and longer payment timelines, we may see less available units, particularly in neighborhoods where housing is already quite limited. That outcome could undermine the equity goals the bill is meant to advance. We support the broader goal of accountability and fair rent setting, absolutely. We do urge the committee to explore narrower solutions, improving coordination between DCHA and the rent administrator, modernizing rent reasonableness data, which we believe is particularly broken right now, and reducing any administrative lag, as opposed to merging two distinct systems into one. Chair White and members of the committee, I do thank you for the opportunity, as always, to testify. We recognize and appreciate the intent behind this legislation, but as currently written, it does risk slowing down lease-ups, confusing compliance standards, and discouraging participation in programs that already need stability and more clarity. We would ask the committee to pause this bill and, as Councilmember Fruman, I believe, alluded to earlier, work towards a version that protects affordability while keeping the system functional for everyone involved and encouraging more participation and more people to gain housing, access to housing. I thank you for your time and for your continued leadership, all of you, on housing issues in the district. Happy to answer any questions and very much look forward to working together.
Thank you very much. Artemis Eden, welcome. If you would turn your microphone on.
Well, content without context is meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. Now, let me put some context. My name is Artemis Solutionator Eden. I've been in this town since 1979. I graduated from Georgetown University at 19 years old. I was mentored by the chief information scientist after he retired from the CIA. And I've been walking for over 50 years. Why? And why? Because y'all treat us like sheep. We're not sheep. I work for the lost ones, the masses of people that have no voice. All you have to do is look around here and see. It's just data in the computers. So let's start being realistic here, okay? We're talking about program this, program that, program this, program that, and it's all about the money. And the fundamental problem that we're dealing here with is that the social compact that made the United States the exceptional country has gone out the window. It's no longer the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated. It's those who have the goal make the rules. Now, I'm a Jew. We have a concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, to help repair the world. So I'm here mostly as a solutionator to answer questions, because the way you learn is by listening. Now, give you some background. I speak 5 languages, 97 countries, worked as vice president international farmer, arguably one of the most powerful lobbyists in the world. I control millions of dollars. But my greatest credential is this. Okay, I was a jailbird in the DC judicial jail, lawyer, prosecutor, industrial process. Now, when I was in jail, 93% of the people were Black. 93% of the people in DC are not Black. And they were eating the same thing every day and watching Basketball Wives. And when you got out, they say reentry. This is a reentry card. Well, let me tell you something. They never left. The people in jail never left. And you treat us like this. And you think that we're going to drink your Kool-Aid. All of this stuff that you're discussing is based on money. Now, let me tell you what I get a voucher and have for 12 years. I get food stamps, I get energy assistance, I get Medicaid and Medicare. I know every NGO, nonprofit organizations. And you know what? In some of my circles, they call them poverty pimps. They live off of the poor people. In fact, if you are an economist and you study world economics, you'll realize that the greatest wealth is living off the poverty of the billions of people.
Now, Ms. Eden,
Now-
I've got to, hold on, no.
Okay.
I've got to pause you because I'm gonna cut everybody else off later and they're gonna say, how come you let him go on? So I'll let you go on a little bit longer.
well-
But I've got to wrap it up. Let me give you 20 seconds to.
Yeah. Having said that, I invite you all to get to the crux of the problem. It's not a financial problem. It's a cultural, social problem where the poor people are being led by the nose and not being encouraged to lift themselves up, which they can, because to be poor is to hustle. You can't navigate the system without hustling.
I agree. Now, I got to conclude you there. I'm gonna move into questions and I appreciate your testimony. Ms. Peters, you mentioned the concern around dual compliance. So if this law were to pass, landlords would have dual compliance, but wouldn't they just be charging the rent that their other tenants are paying in a rent stabilized building?
Because of the way that the voucher program has additional requirements surrounding the administration of it, that is effectively an entirely separate set of rules for compliance. Just because the charge would be the same doesn't necessarily mean that the entire set of rules that you have to follow would be the same. For rent controlled apartments, there's a specific formula calculate. However, for housing choice voucher program tenants, there's a whole different set of rules and requirements that have to be met, particularly for the unit itself. My understanding, and hopefully I'm not incorrect on this still, is that even the permitting process, the inspection process, all of that, the lease-up process, it's entirely distinct.
But they have to go through all those processes for a tenant with a voucher. The only difference is the landlord would only be able to charge the rent controlled rent, essentially, the rent stabilized rent.
Correct. And I think one thing that's important to note is for rent controlled units, those rents have not increased for, I don't want to say the wrong number, but only I believe what you put into place maybe a year ago is that they started increasing again after COVID. And that was still lower than general market rate increases. We still took, I think it was 12% over the course of 2 years when inflation was significantly higher than that. So, I mean, I think inherently that's always been our biggest concern with this, is that we haven't been able to see any sort of generally what we believe to be comparable to what our operational costs have increased in the costs of rent control. But then to put on top of that, in terms of housing choice voucher program requirements, like my colleague said before, and we have many of the same problems, is that the lease-up process can take significantly longer. Whereas for a rent-controlled unit, yes, you're only getting a certain amount, but it's a much faster process. versus every other hurdle you have to overcome in terms of the housing choice voucher program.
Okay. I guess where I still am is, we do have an issue with some landlords over concentrating issues, high needs in their buildings, and we have to respond to it.
I think that what was said before was interesting, and I hope I don't say anything that my members don't agree with, so please don't hold me to this, is a particular amount where I believe you said if we believe that we have too many, we set a cap or something along those lines. I mean, I think that could potentially be a way to discourage that oversaturation, or when we've seen bad actors who have seemingly taken advantage of the system. I think that that's ultimately what the council is going at, is to people who have perhaps taken advantage of the system and oversaturated a market where there was just no room, where there was no space.
We are looking at that, and so we'll talk through that as a possible solution. I would just say, we can't do nothing given the level and seriousness of the things coming to us. Mr. Is it Wivel?
Let's do Wyville.
Wyvel, thank you. Sorry. Actually, all the questions I have for you, you answered in your testimony, so appreciate your efficiency. Mr. Eden, I appreciate your testimony. We've had some conversation. I think we need to have more. I agree with you. We got to get to the root of the issues. Otherwise, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. Let me turn to Councilmember Fruinen.
Thank you very much. And I will say Tikkun Olam, that's our goal here. So thank you very much for reminding us of our goal. Mr. Wyville, thank you for your testimony. 100% for it. I want to help transit workers find housing near where they work. Teachers, firefighters, police. Doesn't mean we don't do it for transit workers, but let's keep our eye on all of our frontline folks who are so critical to us. And Ms. Peter, how should I pronounce your name so your mother's proud?
Catalan is fine. Catalan's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want your mother to be proud. I do think the idea of a cap is an idea that has been thrown around, but it comes up against prohibitions on source of income restrictions. And so I'm not sure that a cap is possible.
I'm not sure either, to be frank.
So, it is an idea that we're thinking about because we have a building, Councilmember Lewis George was here. It's essentially 100% voucher in Ward 4. And it's a building that's been chopped up into smaller and smaller units so that, the more people are packed in, and they're getting very high rents using the rent reasonableness test, even as it exists now. Partly because, and there's a lot of conversation about all the different things that are a challenge, but rent reasonableness doesn't take into account square footage. So if you have a 3-bedroom apartment, but it's 1,000 square feet, it can capture a reasonable rent for a 2,000 square foot 3-bedroom apartment, which is a problem. And then what you land with is a building with very high needs people packed in close to each other. And we closed DC General in order to get away from that kind of scenario. And DC General at least had people there delivering services. So we don't want to take a challenge and just move it out of the public realm and move it into the private realm and have the same or worse conditions. So figuring out how we deal with that, that's a challenge. We'll keep going with the conversation. I do think the voucher system has its own set of paperwork. The rent stabilization system has a kind of paperwork to it, but if you are in a rent stabilized building and you're renting to a voucher tenant, you'd have to deal with all of that voucher paperwork. The question is, what's the reasonable rent for that unit. And the whole idea of the rent reasonableness test is the government shouldn't be paying more than the market would be paying. And in a rent stabilized setting, what the market would be paying is the rent stabilized rent. And to Ms. Kalma's point, it very well could be that that is more predictable and secure than the rent reasonableness test now, which runs a program to look at comparables in the nearby area. And who knows what those comparables will be at one moment. And who knows, that moves around a lot. Whereas I think that there's a powerful argument that this would simplify the process in a rent stabilized setting as opposed to making it more complex.
I mean, it's a provocative thought because the rent reasonableness standards that we've currently had our members working with have come back with vastly across the board numbers, even still. And perhaps, again, I may be speaking out of turn, but we do have some members who haven't seen any sort of increases, even with submissions to the rent reasonableness. They've done appeals. It's very clear that their unit is worth much more than the rent reasonableness came back. And then I think we've seen outliers where it was strangely higher. So I think in general, and I hope I'm not speaking out of school, I believe that the systems used currently for rent reasonableness are more of a national general standard versus something that's more specific to the DMV, more specific particularly to DC. I think if we're applying a standardized system for that, we're going to see inconsistent numbers in terms of rent reasonableness, and we're going to see people who are currently very unhappy in terms of what they're getting back. But on the other side, the flip side is if we go towards this only rent stabilized standards, we already have so much pain in terms of our rent controlled housing where these rents have not gone up in years. The costs and operational costs have just continued to go up. And there's this constant risk of, well, is it going to go up next year? Is it not? Are we going to get hit back again?
I mean, I was struck a year or so back, there was a story in the Post about what was happening with rents and how rents in the region were up by like 20%, but in the district, they were up by like 2%. And I mean, I actually think that our market rents are it's our market rents that are not going up recently. There were a couple of years where in the rent stabilized space, there weren't increases, but mostly they've been going up. And in the year where the rents in the district went up 2%, the authorized increase in the rent stabilized space was more like 4 or 5%, which tells me that our market rents went up less. So I'm just not so sure where the numbers land you in terms of impact. I think it's useful for you and I and Mr. Hunter and Chairman White to have a conversation and look at numbers.
I agree. I wholly agree.
All right. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to this panel. I'm sorry, Councilmember Trayon White. My apologies. All right. We will move to our next panel of public witnesses. Lee Simon, Wanda Harris, Michael Huck, Chair, or Huke, Chair of CIH Properties Incorporated, Philip Simon, Amanda Korber, Supervising Attorney with Legal Aid DC, and David Gottfried, and Hunter Place. Okay, and someone signed up as Hunter Place Condo Association. Lee Simon, you can begin your testimony. Welcome.
Hello, and thank you. And I'm on the witness list twice as 9 and 11, unless there's two Lee Simons, but I'm only testifying one time. Chairperson White and members of the Housing Committee, thank you for allowing me to testify today. I'm here to testify in opposition to B 260070, the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. As written, this legislation will make it significantly harder for tenants with rental subsidies to secure housing, particularly in high opportunity neighborhoods. It introduces an enforcement regime that is not funded, not feasible, and not operationally possible, even if resources were unlimited. I think DHCD put its best in their written testimony. We oppose the bill as written. The legislation proposes structural changes and unfunded mandates that will reduce the district's affordable housing supply, obstruct implementation of tenant-based subsidy programs, and create measurable operational and fiscal burdens for both landlord partners and district agencies. The bill is being advanced for the wrong reasons, and it does not solve the problems its supporters raise. Much of the pressure for this bill is coming from residents in high opportunity neighborhoods who don't want voucher holders as neighbors. I have read their testimony. Many raised understandable concerns about crime, safety, drug use, etc. Unfortunately, this bill does not address a single one of those issues. It does not provide supportive services, does not fund social workers, does not strengthen enforcement against tenant-caused violations, and does not create a reasonable pathway to remove tenants who are causing problems. Instead, the bill simply makes it economically impossible for voucher holders to access these neighborhoods at all. It would effectively redline subsidized tenants out of Ward 3 and similar communities, pushing families into areas with fewer resources, older housing, and more instability. Legal Aid has already warned the council about this exact outcome. In its 2023 testimony, Legal Aid wrote, "We cannot deny that this legislation will make it that much harder for voucher holders to find housing. This is the unavoidable truth. Voucher holders already struggle to place subsidies, and this bill will make that process substantially worse. Families who relied on the current systems, families who love their schools and communities, will face displacement based solely on the structure of this proposal. Lastly, this bill creates a mandate that is not only unfunded, but is not possible to implement. It defines a new role, subsidy administrator, then directs them to withhold payments to all housing providers until they can determine the maximum rent control rate for 20,000 units. Compare that rate to rent reasonableness, void and rewrite contracts for all units that don't comply, and then continuous and ongoing compliance for thousands of units a month. Even if DCHA and other subsidy administrators had unlimited staff and funding, this would not be possible. To make this determination for any given unit, you have to pull the filings going back 4 decades when the law was first written, go through them one by one to determine the effective date of that unit's exemption, then apply a complicated catch-up algorithm to come up with today's rent. And since the historic filings are often incomplete, incorrect, missing, or just filed differently because the law has been amended so many times, even if they exist, the correct rent is usually impossible to determine. This proposal should not go to markup. The problem isn't that it needs more amendments or denser legal language. The problem is the bill is built on a fundamentally unworkable framework that will shrink the low-income housing supply, shut families out of high opportunity neighborhoods, burden district agencies with unachievable mandates, and destabilize thousands of tenancies across the district. For these reasons, the council should abandon this proposal altogether. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wanda Harris, you are next.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, members of the council. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Wanda Harris, and I'm a resident in Ward 4. And I'm here again today to testify in strong support of Bill B 260070, the Rent Stabilization Amendment Act of 2025. The district housing programs were intended to provide safe, stable housing for a variety of residents needing housing and rent support. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the past several years is a pattern of exploitation by certain developers and property owners who turn these programs into profit-driven enterprises. These landlords receive guaranteed rent payments, often funded by public dollars, yet repeatedly failing to meet even the most basic maintenance and safety obligations. Despite being cited for hundreds of thousands of dollars in violations, they continue to operate with little accountability. This conduct transforms subsidized housing from a public good into a revenue stream built on neglect. Tenants are left to endure unsafe, unsanitary, and unhealthy living conditions that have measurable impacts on their physical, emotional, and mental well-being. This dynamic harms not only tenants, but also neighboring residents and the broader community. The cycle of neglect and profit disproportionately affects minority and low-income families, perpetuating inequities reminiscent of earlier eras of housing discrimination. When property owners treat fines as the cost of doing business, it signals a clear disregard for both the law and the people these programs are meant to serve. The inaction of this neglect owners undermines the integrity of the district's affordable housing initiatives and erodes public trust in our system of accountability. I urge the council to pass this legislation. It's not perfect. There are amendments that have to be made, but I urge you to take meaningful steps to ensure oversight and enforcement. The district should suspend the ability of persistent, non-compliant landlords to acquire additional properties until existing violations are corrected, and revoke those licenses where patterns of neglect are evident. These owners have benefited financially while residents have paid the price in deteriorating living conditions and declining community health. Residents of the District of Columbia deserve more than temporary fixes. They deserve safe, dignified, and well-maintained housing. I'm not sure what the answer is, but as you said, Chairman, we can't ignore that there's a serious issue. I think that the bill should be passed, Bill B 260070. It's a necessary step with obvious amendments that are needed towards restoring fairness, accountability, and integrity into our housing system. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your continued commitment to protecting DC residents. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Michael Huke, Chair of CIH Properties.
My name is Michael Huke, Chairman and founder of CIH Properties, which owns and manages 2,013 affordable apartments in Wards 7 and 8. CIH has financed, developed, and operated affordable housing in the district for over 50 years, serving thousands of working-class families. CIH opposes the bill, which would remove the rent control exemption for apartments rented to residents using tenant-based vouchers. DC's affordable housing industry is in crisis due to pandemic-era legislation and a dysfunctional Superior Court landlord-tenant branch. Within CIH's own portfolio, the average time from rent delinquency to eviction is 23 months. During that time, apartments remain occupied but rent-free, destroying the rent revenue needed for payroll, operating costs, and mortgage payments. Industry-wide, unpaid rent is likely between $750 million and $1 billion. The consequences are visible. Foreclosures are accelerating. A prominent broker estimates there have been over 100 properties lost in the past 12 months alone. When lenders take over these buildings, they often become zombie properties, understaffed, undermaintained, and vulnerable to illegal occupancy by criminals, compounding community decline. Under current law, properties leased to voucher holders are exempt from rent control. That allows housing providers to rent to housing choice voucher tenants at HUD-approved small area fair market rents, ensuring that rents reflect actual market comparability, not decades-old rent formulas. By eliminating this exemption, the bill would discourage landlords from accepting vouchers, particularly in small or affordable properties, freeze HTV rents far below HUD-approved market levels, creating a two-tier system where voucher tenants are effectively priced out of available units, and undermining HUD's federal rent reasonableness processes, exposing the district to potential federal compliance conflicts. In short, the amendment would reduce, not expand voucher access, contradicting its stated purpose of promoting affordability. Policy consequences would further erode affordable unit supply. Providers now face 25% vacancy and delinquency revenue losses. Rising insurance, legal, and operating costs cannot withstand additional rent restrictions. Discourage acceptance of housing choice vouchers. Rent control linkage would create uncertainty, red tape, and potentially lower rents than permitted by federal guidelines. Increase foreclosures and displacement. Each new restriction pushes more properties towards insolvency, creating the very instability the council seeks to avoid. Conflict with federal law and policy. HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program preempts local ceilings. Federal subsidies are designed to mirror market comparables, not rent-stabilized caps. The council should reject the bill and focus on stabilizing the affordable housing ecosystem through judicial reform to reduce the 23-month eviction timelines, financial stabilization grants or arrearage relief programs, and incentives for landlords to maintain and expand voucher participation. Affordable housing providers like CIH have invested for decades to preserve safe, quality communities in Ward 7 and 8. This bill would punish these essential private providers for continuing to serve voucher holders while doing nothing to fix the real crisis, the collapse of enforcement of lease and revenue integrity in DC's rental housing system. The district must stabilize this system, not strangle it further, because it's dying.
Thank you very much, Patrick Merkel.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Hi, I'm Patrick Merkel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. I think might be appropriate to mention it. I've been in DC since 1979. I came here, I took advantage of rent control, or actually naturally occurring affordable housing, and was able to get started on my law school career, paying rents for a two-bedroom as low as $250 a month at 9th and E Northeast, which is now a condo building, which I think actually had to go back to being apartments because condos have become unfavored in the city as more people are willing to rent than own. But shortly after I moved here, I bought a small building on Capitol Hill, which I still own to this day. I've owned it now almost 40 years. And I've watched the neighborhood go from a place where I had to hire police officers in their squad cars off duty to bust up drug activity to now homes selling over $800,000. I continue to maintain my building in a super condition. I'm real proud of how the building, even though it's as old as I am, has gone through a couple of metamorphoses and is really a beautiful property, just as competitive as anything that would be built today, which is probably unusual for housing stock that is 70 years old. But being that as it may, I just wanted to give you some observations. I've maintained a balance between voucher tenants and people who pay out of pocket. And I think that helps the voucher tenants, recognize that, there's a higher standard of living that people can aspire to, and they can do it. Because what we're doing is we're providing them their most expensive housing, living requirement, which is their housing. And if we can do that, and then they can kind of build their lives from there, most of the tenants that I've had are really good. I got into this voucher thing in 2016 when someone answered one of my ads on Craigslist and said, would you take a voucher tenant? I said, well, I think legally I have to if you're paying the same rent. And then it turned out that I was going to get a little premium. And the guy's become a friend. He's still in the building. So super guy. But you know what? He's got high needs. He can't really take care of his place. He needs someone to come in and you know, several times a year, just literally clean it from one end to the other, because Medicaid won't do it. DC Housing won't do it, but I'll do it. I'll have somebody go in there and we'll gladly make sure that he has housing conditions which are up to par. But because of a heart condition and heart failure that may claim him certainly before, and likely before I go, and he's the same age as I am, I'm very happy that he's a tenant. But that's one of the things that I think small landlords with voucher tenants are doing that is under the radar. I mentioned this to Councilmember Fruman at a meeting about 4 or 5 months ago, that you have to take into account the fact that a lot of voucher tenants have needs that are actually being met by their landlords. And in 1997, I actually ran for DC Council, and one of the things that I said should be done was to do exactly what Councilmember Fruman is arguing for now. That is, why on earth are we spending all this money on vouchers when we could be taking advantage of rent control at the district level? Now I know why. And I realize that it is a two-tiered system, vouchers and market, and it kind of has to stay that way, because people don't get vouchers because their lives are normal. People get vouchers because they have special needs. And
Patrick, I got to pause you. You're almost a minute over.
well, I appreciate your letting me go on there, but that's my point for today.
I appreciate it. I'll come back to you with some questions. Philip Simon.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on Bill 26-0070. Let me get my video on. Go. I do not support this bill. Many residents expressing support for this bill are citing concerns about neglectful housing providers, which are unrelated to the substance of this legislation. This bill rests on two false premises. First, that voucher tenants are undermining rent control, and second, that voucher tenants are inherently problematic. Both are wrong and dangerous. The voucher program cannot meaningfully distort rent control. DCHA administers about 18,000 tenant-based vouchers. Even if half are in rent-controlled units, that's only a small share of over 90,000 rent-controlled units. Legislating against such a narrow group won't stabilize rents or improve affordability. It only creates the illusion of reform. Equally troubling is the notion that voucher tenants are bad tenants. This bill was prompted by a handful of behavioral cases that spiraled into legislative overreach. Housing providers and tenant advocates alike struggle to deal with truly disruptive residents because there are no effective tools to remove them. One bad actor can upend the life for an entire building. We're unable to get them out. The court takes years. Law enforcement offers no support. The Department of Buildings won't intervene. The mayor's proposed fixes were watered down. On and on it goes. The answer isn't to push voucher holders back into disinvested neighborhoods. It is to provide services for those who need them and to fix the enforcement system. This exemption has long promoted access to high opportunity neighborhoods. Removing it would effectively redline voucher families out of those areas. Rent-controlled apartments will simply go to higher income households with perfect credit. Owners already operating under rent control are stretched thin. If a property can't support maintenance, it becomes unlivable for everyone. When I argue that rent-controlled rents can't cover operating costs, someone inevitably says you can file a hardship petition. That is a fiction. In response to a FOIA request for hardship petitions from January 1st, 2022 through February 5th, 2024, the district produced three petitions that were provisionally approved, one of which was contested, and not a single one received final approval. Not one owner obtained full relief in over 2 years. Multi-family housing providers in DC are already at a breaking point. Costs keep rising: interest rates, insurance, material, labor, utilities, taxes, while rents are flat or falling. In 2024, new multifamily starts in DC fell 79% to just 932 units, compared to a 25% national drop cited by BizNow. Developers are walking away amid policy uncertainty and collapsing project economics. This bill adds yet another layer of unpredictability to a market already fatigued. DC is not open for business. Don't continue to legislate your citizens into insolvency. Business owners in DC are not inherently villains. Municipal agencies will also be hit hard. DCHA, DHCD, and DHS are already overwhelmed. The city is still rolling out its rent registry. Thousands of filings remain unreviewed, and evictions are stalled. DCHA's turnaround is ongoing, and even routine approvals take months. Requiring DCHA to recalculate every voucher rent for household and rent-controlled units, potentially 10,000 leases, is simply not feasible. The additional work required to complete this task outlined in the bill is unfunded. The new rent registry is not configured to comply with the rigorous demands set forth in this bill. As revenues fall, net operating income will drop, property values will decline, and the city's tax base will erode. Those economic tremors will ripple through the entire housing ecosystem.
Mr. Simon, I got to pause you. You're almost a minute over, so let me pause you there, but I will come back with questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amanda Korber, Supervising Attorney with Legal Aid DC.
Thank you, Chairman White and members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Amanda Korber, and I'm a supervising attorney in Legal Aid's housing unit, and I'm also a Ward 7 resident. I'm here today to testify in support of the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. This bill is sorely needed, but I want to make clear about why Legal Aid supports this bill. There's been a lot of concerning rhetoric in recent years about there being too many voucher holders in rent-controlled buildings, what that means for the buildings. And folks will point to this policy, the exemption from rent stabilization for vouchers, as the reason. And that is not why Legal Aid supports this bill. We are glad that voucher holders are able to find units across the city in wards that 10 or maybe even 5 years ago, they had a harder time accessing. And we don't want that to change. And to this end, I just want to say that the idea of like quotas came up earlier, like a quota for voucher holders in a building. And I just want to note that in addition to just kind of being problematic, it is also wildly discriminatory, both source of income discrimination and also, I suspect, would implicate racial discrimination as well in the District of Columbia. But now the reason why Legal Aid does support this bill. Legal Aid supports this bill because it does not make sense for landlords to be able to charge DCHA more than they would charge any other tenant and have the government pay more in rent than they could collect from any other tenant. We support this bill because it should mean that DCHA is paying less per voucher in rent stabilized units on at least a substantial number of vouchers, leading hopefully to more voucher availability for other district residents. Given that the council has had a difficult time funding vouchers in recent years, this would be an incredible outcome, especially given the length of the voucher list that DCHA has had, with tenants waiting decades to get a voucher. And then I want to, I had some other planned comments, but I want to address, there have been a couple of witnesses talking about how this will lead to redlining, how voucher holders will be excluded from parts of the city. And I just want to say that be source of income discrimination, those landlords in those buildings would still have to consider a voucher holder just as they would any other resident. I do agree that we'd be moving from a system where perhaps those landlords have an incentive to rent to voucher holders that might be removed. And so we may see an uptick in source of income discrimination claims, or we might have to see, the Office of Human Rights take a more aggressive, or DCHA perhaps would be the entity, take a more aggressive approach to ensuring that source of income discrimination doesn't happen. But this bill on its own should not lead to that. Doing that, excluding people from a building because they are a voucher holder would still be illegal. And this council should, take steps to make sure that the other agencies in the district that are supposed to prevent that from happening are doing their job to make sure it doesn't happen. Once the incentive to get increased rent for no reason from a voucher holder is removed. The other things I'd like to address, there has been some talk about all voucher holders are high needs. It's simply not true. There are certain types of vouchers, permanent supportive housing vouchers, maybe others that do require a tenant to have disabilities and need wraparound services, but that is not true of all voucher holders, maybe most voucher holders, and that's a problematic assumption to have about voucher holders in general. I guess I will just close by saying that we're very excited that this bill is being reintroduced and considered again. We've seen the problem that Councilmember Louis George has seen of developers paying large sums because they plan on ridding rent stabilized units of non-voucher holding tenants and replacing them with voucher holders once the deal is done. And it's led to a hard time getting TOPA deals done. And so we are, really excited about this bill, happy to work with the committee, happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. David Gottfried.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, council members. My name is David Gottfried, and I live with my wife and 2 children on the 1300 block of Longfellow Street Northwest in Ward 4. I want to start by thanking council members Robert White, Fruman, Louis George, Henderson, Pinto, and Mendelson in particular, some of whom in absentia, for meeting with me individually, in some cases many times over the course of several years, about the issue we're discussing today. I'm here to express my strong support for the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. About 5 years ago, a company called Petra Development began buying rent-controlled buildings in my neighborhood. Petra now owns at least 6 large buildings within about a quarter-mile radius. My community's experience with Petra is not unique. It reflects a troubling citywide trend happening in every ward and neighborhood by a significant number of companies like Petra. Here's the pattern. Step 1. Buy older rent-controlled buildings. Step 2, offer buyouts to tenants who are willing to leave. For those who don't want to take the offer, make living conditions so intolerable that tenants are effectively forced out. Step 3, renovate the building. And I'll use quotes when I say renovate. These renovations are not about improving quality of life. Instead, they are meant to cram as many tiny bedrooms as possible into each unit. Studios become 2 or even 3 bedroom apartments. 2-bedroom units are converted into 4 or 5-bedroom units. This maximizes voucher payments under rent reasonableness formulas, which consider the number of bedrooms, but not the square footage or livability of each unit. Step 4, market the units exclusively to voucher holders. Why? Because voucher payments are exempt from rent control, allowing landlords to collect 200 to 400% more revenue per unit than rent-controlled rates. These figures are not an exaggeration. And I'll quote here from the Washington Post, which did an extensive investigative piece on Petra recently, talking about a building around the corner from me, 5616 13th Street Northwest. Salems, who's the CEO of Petra Enterprise, bought in 2018 and renamed the Madison. By buying out tenants of rent-stabilized units and moving in voucher recipients, he nearly tripled his rent from each unit, records show. Step 5. Cut maintenance and security costs to the bone. Petra has been fined hundreds of thousands of dollars for housing code violations, most recently $550,000 for hundreds of infractions across its portfolio. Many of these violations remain unaddressed, according to the Department of Housing. Step 6, enrich themselves while tenants suffer in unsafe, unsanitary conditions. This building model was first pioneered locally by Sam Razjuyan. a landlord notorious for millions in unpaid fines and the exploitation of the voucher system. Petra and dozens of imitators have simply scaled up this approach. To be clear, buildings housing predominantly low-income tenants can work if they include robust wraparound services, mental health support, case management, on-site assistance, etc. But that's not what Petra or others are doing. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services actually advises against having more than 25% of a building's units occupied by voucher holders unless those services are in place. In a Washington Post investigation by Steve Thompson, the architect of the National Housing First model, whose name is Sam Sembreris, called Petra's approach entire buildings of voucher tenants without services. He called it a setup for disaster. Our city's most vulnerable residents deserve safe, clean, and dignified housing. Voucher holders should be able to use their vouchers anywhere in the city without facing illegal discrimination. And yes, we must continue to enforce laws against that discrimination, absolutely. I fully agree with Ms. Korber, who spoke just before me. The answer is to vigorously go after illegal discrimination so that voucher tenants can live where they want to, rather than being funneled into certain buildings owned by Petra and others. But what we cannot do is keep rewarding unscrupulous landlords for providing deplorable housing. Under the current system, we overpay bad actors while underserving the very people these programs are meant to help. In my community, the results have been devastating. Unsafe and unsanitary conditions, police raids, shootings, drug trafficking, and prostitution. Much of the criminal activity is being committed not by the tenants, but by street crews who have taken over units from vulnerable residents, and this is a pattern. These are predictable outcomes of a broken incentive structure. There's a saying in business, tell me what the incentives are and I'll tell you what the outcome will be. Our city's housing system is built on the wrong incentives. As long as we continue to pay enormous premiums, 200 to 400%, for voucher units exempt from rent control, companies like Petra and individuals like Samraz Julian will keep exploiting the system and our communities will keep suffering the consequences.
Mr. Godfrey, you're about a minute over. I'm gonna have to move to our next witness.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sharice Liu.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Sharice Liu, an attorney with the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. The Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless is pleased to see the introduction of the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. It moves DC a step forward in addressing its affordability crisis and increasing access to safe and affordable housing by closing a harmful loophole that exempts units subsidized by the government from rent stabilization laws. This is a necessary step to fulfilling DC's goal of increasing housing choices, opportunities, and affordability for DC residents. In general, we support the removal of the rent stabilization exemption for any residential property that is federally and DC government assisted. Current law frustrates DC's affordability efforts and incentivizes income discrimination in violation of both DC Human Rights Act and the Eviction Record Sealing and Fairness in Renting Amendment Act. Source of income discrimination is unlawful. Landlords must accept applicants in a way that complies with the law. The current exemption perpetuates the perception that renting to government subsidy recipients is an option instead of a legal obligation. Landlords should not need an incentive to follow the law. Additionally, the council should not delay ending this exemption for month-to-month leases to October 2027, as many voucher holders and government subsidized units hold month-to-month leases. It is unclear the reason behind the delay to remove the exemption for month-to-month leases instead of applying the law equally and universally to all rental properties and units that qualify at once. As stated, the rent stabilization exemption for subsidized units frustrates affordability for low-income DC residents, and that includes those under month-to-month leases. To avoid confusion and provide better access to affordable housing for DC residents, the council should not delay removing the exemption. DC was recently cited as having the most dramatic wealth gap in the nation, which is compounded with racial disparities that are similarly grim. Closing loopholes in our consumer protection laws and housing policies that incentivize predatory and discriminatory practices by landlords is crucial to eliminate these shameful and preventable disparities. The Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless appreciates that through this legislation, DC Council is listening to the concerns of DCHA residents, community members, advocates, and HUD We look forward to collaborating with the council to further expand access to affordable housing while increasing and safeguarding precious housing resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much to this panel. Let me ask a few questions to get smarter on my end. Patrick Merkel, one of your closing arguments was that the government should pay more for people with vouchers because housing providers have to meet tenant needs. What of your tenants' needs are you handling? I didn't catch that in your testimony.
Well, it just so happens that I, perhaps by experience, I'm getting folks from the facility at 8th and Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. They refer clients to me who can live in the city, but who do have counselors and who need follow-up care. Unfortunately, the follow-up care is usually monthly, and these folks' needs are closer to daily. And what I do is with the other tenants in the building, and one in particular that we're having right now, we just help with housekeeping, even laundry, shopping. A lot of these people come to us to have no internet experience. They don't realize they can order their groceries from Safeway. They don't know how to use a dishwasher. They're afraid of the disposal. And like just yesterday, the one I'm thinking of right now called because she had no heat, because she didn't know how to use a thermostat. This kind of stuff is not, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that in a big building, unless they have a caring resident manager, these folks get lost. When they're in a 6-unit building with me, 4 of whom are voucher holders, 2 of whom are not, there's people they can turn to.
I appreciate. Let me move on to a couple other questions. Amanda Korber, I appreciate your testimony in that of Sharice Liu about source of income discrimination. Of course, there is still discrimination in the city, even though it's not legal, which I don't like at all. But I recognize it's true. But my question is a little different for you. If there's no financial incentive, do you think it will be harder for residents with vouchers to find housing?
I think given that source of income discrimination is illegal, it shouldn't be. Do I agree that because this incentive is removed, there will likely be more source of income discrimination?
I'm asking something
Yes.
else. Well, does the incentive that's in place now, does that incentive help people with vouchers find housing?
I mean, I think, again, like I'm not a landlord, I don't rent. This is all based on like what I've heard and seen anecdotally. But I think yes, in the sense that like if I'm a landlord and I have a rent stabilized unit, and I can get significantly more from a voucher holder than a non-voucher holder, I think that creates an incentive that wasn't there before. And so I may seek that voucher holder out as opposed, and which I think makes it easier for voucher holders to find housing.
David Godfrey, the figure you mentioned in your testimony, where landlords making 200 to 400% more, is that still accurate after the work the Housing Authority has done around rent reasonableness? So for new leases, would that figure still hold up? Is that a symptom of the lack of rent reasonableness that we used to have?
Thank you, Chairman. The answer is I don't know for certain. My instinct is to say that there is still a very significant gap, particularly because the rent reasonableness formula continues to ignore square footage and only looks at the number of bedrooms. So if you took what was a rent-controlled unit, 1-bedroom unit, and you renovated it, again, I'll put renovated in quotes here, you renovated it into a 3-bedroom, then the rent reasonableness formula will look at comparable 3 bedrooms in the vicinity, most of which will be full houses. So again, you're talking about a significant premium. I do not believe that these companies would employ this all voucher model if they weren't getting very significant premiums on the vouchers over the rent controlled prices. I do believe firmly that that delta, that gap between the two pricing models is significant.
Thank you for that. Philip Simon, you mentioned that the market is fatigued and a concern about villainizing landlords. I understand your point. What we're grappling with that I would appreciate your perspective on is somebody like David Gottfried, who lives near a couple of these buildings, would probably say that the housing market is impacted by what's happening in these Petra properties. So there is a problem. Do you have a recommendation for how we address the problem of over concentration of people? To Amanda Corber's point, not everybody with vouchers has high needs, or but some are. And when we over concentrate, we substantially increase the likelihood that you have over concentrated. You have concentrated people with high needs into a building. Do you have recommendations on how we address that problem?
I think we're speaking kind of out of two sides of our mouth. From one side, everyone's saying, voucher holders don't cost anymore. They're inherently not more difficult. But on the other side, we're saying if there's over concentration of voucher holders, that's problematic. Why is that problematic if there's no difference between voucher holders and market rate tenants? And again, all I hear is Petra, Petra, Petra. This bill is not about Petra. If you guys want to solve for bad landlords, I think that you put together a bill that solves for bad landlords. That is not us. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
It doesn't. Let me give some context, right? So what I'm usually doing in my hearing is fact finding. And the difficult, people come with an agenda, and that's fine. I'd come with an agenda too, and I'm trying to pierce the agendas so I can find out what I need to find out. We do create bills for bad landlords, and the good ones will come here and say, hey, you're getting us too, which is what's happening right now. So that's why I'm asking, if we're trying to get the Petra people and not trying to get you, if you're saying you're a good landlord, how do we do that?
I think that you already started to do that by what we've seen in the news over the past 2 or 3 months, where unscrupulous landlords have been fined for not keeping up their buildings. Or, if you have a horrible landlord that's consistently horrible, make an additional tax class, call it tax class 5. We have 1 through 4. Do number 5. Number 5, if you're a horrible landlord, you're paying 10%. That's it. And put them out of business. I mean, you can't hurt everybody in business every year with different legislation. Every year we're refighting the same thing because of 5 people that are creating the problems.
I appreciate that. Let me turn to Councilmember Fruman.
All right. Thank you very much, Chairman White. I do have to say, this whole topic and this hearing has been great. I'm really grateful to you, Chairman White, for having this hearing. Is radioactive. It touches every issue. It touches source of income discrimination. It touches allegations of racial discrimination. It touches issues of conditions in neighborhoods that are deeply problematic. This is hard, and it's hard to talk about it and talk about it levelly and fairly and try to come up with solutions that work. I have to say, really, really grateful to Ms. Korber and Ms. Liu from the Legal Aid Society and from the Washington Clinic for Homeless to ground this conversation, because one piece of it is, how is it that we make our dollars to serve low-income residents go as far as possible. And a problem that we face when we are overpaying landlords relative to what they would be getting from a different tenant is that those are dollars that can't be used for other people. And so a big motivation of this legislation is to make our dollars be able to go farther. And there was a time when it wasn't an issue. It seemed like we had more dollars than we knew what to do with here in the District of Columbia. We are not in that time now. We need to be scrupulous about how we are using our dollars. And this legislation helps us in that space, not by creating an incentive one direction or another, but by leveling the playing field inside of each individual building. If you're a rent stabilized building and you're renting to a non-voucher tenant, you get the rent stabilized rent. If you're renting to a voucher tenant, you get the rent stabilized rent. That's not that complicated. And it takes a bit of gear shifting to get there so that you could implement that, but it is not enormous. And the degree to which it could adversely affect landlords, that's a question of fact about how big is the difference in the amount of payments. I also, Mr. Merkel, I really appreciate your testimony. I do get it, like the way that you talk about how you approach your buildings and others who have come forward who really care about the people who are in their buildings and they go the extra mile. They may get a few more dollars for the voucher tenancies, but they go the extra mile to make it work. And we need to figure out a way to reward that, but that isn't every landlord. And that isn't necessarily what the incentive structure is. Mr. Merkel, I'm curious, you said you had 4 folks who were benefiting from vouchers and 2 who were not.
Right.
How did their rents compare?
Well, now that the rent reasonableness is cut in, I'm actually getting less rent on 2 of my, and that's another thing. I got 4 identical voucher units, 4 different rent levels.
And how do they compare to the rent that you receive from your non-voucher tenants who are subject to the rent stabilization? Or are they subject to rent stabilization?
They are, and that's another thing I wanted to get to, because this whole thing is a gotcha for people who have not increased their annual rent amount as a result of having an exemption. So if you had, like, say you had a rent amount of $1,500 or $1,700 back in 2015, and you didn't take that 5%, 3%, 7% year after year, you get to 2025 and you have the $1,700 level, and now you're being told, oh, we're going to charge you based on your rent.
No, I mean, actually, Mr. Merkel, that isn't that we address that in the legislation as it's come forward. If you have not been taking the rent stabilization increases, you have the opportunity to take them. So it isn't a gotcha in that way. But I am curious, you have 6 units, some are rent stabilized, some are not.
I have a guy who was in Boy Scouts with me back in 2004. He became a tenant in 2007. He's paying $1,775. I love him to death, and I'll never ask him to leave. And I just do the little minimum increases that are allowed. On the other hand, I have another tenant who's paying $2,264 a month, and that is more than 2 of the 4 rent units that I've got in the voucher program, and $200 less than 1 of the units in the voucher program, which is up at the high end of it. So, and why all these are identical units, are completely the same square footage and equipped. And I don't understand how rent reasonableness came up with 4 different rent levels for 4 different units that are identical. But
I mean, I actually think in the rent stabilized approach, you'd have to look at the numbers, but I'm not sure that you wouldn't come out better and with more predictability than under the current system. But I want to turn to Mr. Hugh.
Oh, you're right.
Mr. Hugh, you said you have 2,000 units, and I wonder how many of them are rent stabilized and how many of them are being funded through vouchers?
Majority are rent stabilized. We have two low-income housing tax credit properties. And we have another property that's not rent stabilized. So off the top of my head, majority of ours are rent stabilized.
And in those rent stabilized buildings, because set aside the LIHTC, which doesn't apply, and the non-rent stabilized, but in rent stabilized buildings, how do the rents that you get from your rent stabilized tenants compare to the rents that you get for your voucher funded tenants?
Well, they're in the past they were about the same. Now some of them are lower than the rents we're getting for our units.
For the stabilized units.
Yeah, and we must turn down the voucher because we can't afford to lose any more rent revenue given the rate of delinquencies and
So if that is the case, Mr. Uke, I am puzzled because this legislation would give you a path where you had greater predictability and probably higher rents than what you're getting under the current system. So I don't understand why you are talking about the challenges of financing for properties like yours, and you are arguing against an approach that would probably yield greater revenue to you.
Well, I'm saying that we wouldn't take the voucher if it's not equal to the rents under rent control.
Well, I'm saying that.
So there'll be less housing choice vouchers.
Equal to
housing choice vouchers.
Right, but what I'm telling you and what you're telling me currently under the rent reasonableness test, you might be getting 2,100. And under rent stable, for the units that are subject to rent stabilization, you might be getting 2,200. And I'm saying this legislation would say the reasonable rent for you is what you would get under rent stabilization. And I believe it's $100 more. And so I don't understand why you oppose it.
The housing choice vouchers come in with a variety of what they say is the market rent, and some of the certifications of supposedly market rents for our properties are below what we're actually charging. It's a system that doesn't work very well.
No, and I hear you, and I've run over. It's just that I do think that we get into arguments where people stake out positions and are not looking at what the actual numbers mean. And I think it's really important to look at what the actual numbers mean. And I get the sense from the way that you're answering these questions that if you looked at the actual numbers, you might come in support of this legislation, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Chairman, Councilmember Fruman, we'll get back to you with details of that.
I would really, really appreciate that. I always look forward to talking with you, Mr. Uke, and let's talk about the actual numbers and see how it comes out. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman, and thank you to all of our public witnesses. We will move to our panel of government witnesses, including Daryl Brantley, HPAP Program Manager with the Department of Housing and Community Development, Lauren Pear, Rent Administrator with the Department of Housing and Community Development, and Hamara Gabrades with the DC Housing Authority. Due to a scheduling miscommunication, I understand that DCHA is not presenting a statement today, but will send one with written testimony for the record. But Ms. Gabrades is available to answer questions from the committee. So welcome to our government witnesses. And Daryl Brantley, you can begin your testimony, or are you testifying or just Lauren Pear?
Yes.
Thank you. And where's Hamara Brady's? Oh, there we are. Okay. All right. DHED can begin.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Robert White and members of the Committee on Housing. My name is Daryl Brantley, HPAP Program Manager, testifying on behalf of the Department of Housing and Community Development. We're pleased to provide this testimony today to discuss Bill 26-98, Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025. The proposed legislation seeks to add public transit workers as an eligible group of employees for the District of Columbia's Employer-Assisted Housing Program, or EHAP, which the bill defines as a person employed and licensed to operate or maintain a publicly owned mass transit system within the District of Columbia, including Metrobus, Metro Rail, Metro Access, and DC Streetcar. DHCD supports policies that expand access to homeownerships for public serving employees, including transit workers who work in DC. As written, we believe this bill could affect current program operations and its budget in measurable ways that should be considered and addressed. According to Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, WMATA, or Metro, there are approximately 12,000 employees as of 2022, with approximately 8,700 in Maryland, 1,800 in Virginia, and 1,500 in the District of Columbia. Metro's workforce includes personnel for Metro Rail and Metrobus operations, the Metro Transit Police Department, as well as contractors. The DC streetcar system is owned by the District's Department of Transportation, with services managed and operated by a private company that employs about 50 drivers. The addition of public transit employees as an eligible group could expand the applicant pool for EHAP and increase program utilization. An influx of newly eligible applicants may also extend to our Home Purchase Assistance Program, or HPAP, for those borrowers who meet program's eligibility requirements. EHAP paired with HPAP can be key components of the financial staking that most low to moderate income first-time home buyers need for an opportunity to buy their home in the district. Public transit employees are critical for supporting the daily and economic life of not only district residents, but the entire greater Washington metropolitan region. With that said, we urge the council to consider these recommendations for this proposed legislation. 1, define public transit employee to mean a person employed and licensed to operate or maintain a publicly owned mass transit system subsidized by the District of Columbia. For example, Metrobus, Metro Rail, Metro Access, and other transit services provided by the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority or owned by the DC Department of Transportation. And 2, establish a 2-year pilot program to assess the viability and effectiveness of expansion before committing to full integration, while also considering the impact of economic conditions related to the district's housing market. With these safeguards, incorporating public transit employees into EHAP could help sustain the program's service levels and integrity for current and potentially eligible participants without disruption. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Lauren Pear.
Good afternoon, Chairperson White and members of the Committee on Housing. My name is Lauren Pear. I'm the rent administrator testifying on behalf of the Department of Housing and Community Development. We are pleased to provide this testimony today to discuss Bill 26-70, the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025. The proposed legislation seeks to expand the district's rent stabilization program by making several significant changes. The core aims of the bill will eliminate a longstanding exemption for rental units supported by tenant-based subsidies or vouchers, add notice and payment requirements for rent subsidy administrators and the rent administrator, create standing and challenge rights, prohibit voluntary waiver agreements, limit inappropriate denials of reasonable rent increases, and change the rules for rent resets on vacant units. Although DHCD supports the provision that would increase the rent reset limit for vacancies and understands the importance of anti-displacement policies and transparency in subsidy-funded tenancies, we oppose the bill as written. The legislation proposes structural changes and unfunded mandates that will reduce the district's affordable housing supply, obstruct implementation of tenant-based subsidy programs, and will create measurable operational and fiscal burdens for both landlord partners and district agencies. Summarized below are DHCD's chief concerns on several provisions in the bill. 1, loss of affordable rental supply and an owner exit risk. Removing the longstanding exemption for units leased to tenants using a tenant-based subsidies decreases economic viability and predictability for small and moderate scale housing providers while increasing legal and compliance exposure, especially for owners operating on narrow margins. The bill's new notice, reporting, and challenge responsibilities on subsidy administrators may deter housing providers from participating with vouchers and other tenant-based subsidy programs. These changes will undermine voucher program leasing rates and hinder placements for households that rely on tenant-based assistance from the district's local rent supplement program, LRSP, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and the Family Rent Stabilization Program, FRSP. DHCD foresees the perceived rent ceiling risks and increased regulatory complexity will likely create two immediate adverse market responses. Although it is illegal to discriminate based on income, it's difficult to prove, and this may be one potential outcome of the legislation. The other is housing providers may opt to convert rental units to condominium owner occupancy or other non-rental uses to avoid these new obligations. Both responses will further strain and reduce the district's affordable rental housing stock and the number of available units for thousands of low-income households. Second, chilling effect on affordable housing preservation and production. Housing affordability and insecurity is a growing and urgent need for high-cost cities, such as the District of Columbia. In a 2024 Urban Institute report, there were only 33 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 renter households with extremely low incomes in the district. As of that report, it was estimated that over 58,000 households with very low incomes could not afford their rent in DC. The district's local rent supplement program often supports households living in housing accommodations financed by our Housing Production Trust Fund. These two locally funded resources, along the federal Housing Choice Voucher Funds, are essential tools frequently combined by developers to build and preserve affordable housing projects that provide housing for residents at the lowest income levels, 30% of median family income and below. Subsidy programs typically follow the federal rent reasonableness standard, which regulates rent ceilings and adjustments to effectively ensure our lowest income residents have more access and choice in their housing options. DHCD and other district agencies rely on our partnerships with private owners to preserve and expand our stock of subsidized and affordable units. Changing exemption on subsidies may raise risks for developers as they put together financing packages on their affordable housing projects now and in the future, and result in their leaving the market. Without maintaining and expanding these partnerships, we risk losing our inventory of affordable housing and further slow down our production, preservation, and rehabilitation projects that are already constrained by rising construction insurance and inflationary costs. Third, administrative and fiscal challenges. The new administrative requirements proposed in this bill also raise concerns about the impact on our Rental Accommodations Division, RAD, which is responsible for oversight of the district's rent stabilization program. The bill would require housing providers to provide a subsidy administrator with a copy of the rent adjustment notices from the rent administrator, require subsidy administrators to withhold payments until notices are provided, and require subsidy administrators to file annual unit level lists with RAD. RAD recently released the new public rent control database to require all housing providers to re-register their housing accommodations in this online system. RAD's current business practice through the new rent control database makes generating paper notices fundamentally impracticable. The database would require significant redesign to add this as a function, and this produces fiscal impacts on RAD's administration of the new requirements, including but not limited to reprogramming the system, personnel costs, training and outreach costs, and memoranda of understanding between DHCD and agencies which administer subsidy programs. We believe that delaying subsidy payments for housing providers could jeopardize the cash flow necessary for the upkeep and maintenance of quality housing conditions. In an economic climate where affordable housing providers are challenged with historic levels of arrearages due to a decline in rent payments from tenants over the last few years, delaying subsidy payments places them at greater financial risk. This poses potential for the district to lose more of our existing affordable housing units and for more families to lose their homes. The legislation being considered today intends to close a perceived loophole that does not exist. Rents tied to tenant-based subsidies cannot be regulated by the rent stabilization program because subsidy programs are substantively different. The differences include variances in rent adjustment schemes, which are incompatible with one another due to funding sources behind each program, varying rent adjustment schedules, as well as mechanisms and rules for challenging aspects of subsidized lease agreements. As part of the council's efforts to ensure rent conformity between subsidy program rents and rent stabilized housing, DHCD recommends the council consider convening a roundtable discussion with all interested parties after this public hearing. This legislation proposes a major change in administration of the Rental Housing Act, and a roundtable may clarify unresolved issues and help reach a consensus on the best way to address rent levels for units rented to tenants with tenant-based subsidies. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you both for your testimonies. In what way is this, Ms. Pear, an unfunded mandate?
Well, particularly, I mean, I'll talk in context of my program. We have the rent control database, which, as you know, we just publicly released on June 2nd. Adding in the thousands of units that are under the voucher program into the rent control database system will require some redesign, some redevelopment, which will cause, additional time and resources. I'm operating with a very small staff to launch the current database as it is, and I just foresee that this would expand our objective of, having a viable and, well-working rent control database system.
These units are not anticipated to be in the database as it's designed now?
They're in the database now in terms of registration, council member, but they receive chairperson, but they receive an exemption. So once the registration is entered and the units are recorded, that's the end of the rental accommodation division's responsibility until there's some kind of a change in the status of the exemption.
And okay, so they are in or going into the database.
Right.
So let me go back to them. What would be different?
Well, as I recall from the legislation, there's an additional duty of the subsidy rent administrator. We'll have to certify the rents that the rent stabilized rents that are being input into the system. My understanding of the statute of the legislation.
Do you not have to do that for the other rent controlled units?
No, we don't. It's more of a passive system in terms of, for example, if we have a rent stabilized unit, the landlord or the housing provider, is the one that records the rents. The rent control database will, takes the allowable annual rent adjustment of general applicability. That's programmed in, but I foresee there would probably be a different approach in terms of administering and managing these voucher units.
Does DHCD believe that some landlords are seeking to only or mostly rent to tenants with vouchers?
I don't have that type of information. What I'd have to do is, check with our leadership and respond to you later if that's acceptable. In terms of my program, no, I don't necessarily see that. So I don't know, but in the broader scheme of how finance development is done, I couldn't comment on that.
Okay, that's a frustrating answer because you're the person that the
understand.
agency sent. And
I understand that.
I would like a response from the agency.
Of course.
But by the end of the week on that. The last time we considered this legislation, the agencies advised us to wait until the rent registry database was up and running so that DCHA, could check which units are subject to rent stabilization. Now the rent registry is almost fully live. Is there any information we'd need to enact this bill that the database can't provide?
Well, I mean, it's still ongoing. We still have another month of, before the deadline, the 180-day deadline. I would have to go back through the requirements. Honestly, it's been a while since I studied this. I was on leave last week, so I was trying to catch up. So I would have to go back through, check the requirements, but my understanding or my recollection as I have it, is that we're providing certain, notifications to the subsidy administrator about the levels of rent. And so I'd have to take a look and get with our developer and see what kind of impacts that has on our current work process within the database.
If you could circle back on that.
Absolutely.
Councilmember Fruman, I believe, intended for the legislation to affect tenant-based vouchers, not project-based vouchers,
Yes.
with pre-negotiated rents. The current version of the bill makes that clear. Would you agree that the bill should have little to no negative impact on the projects that the district government has decided to give dedicated subsidies to?
Again, I would have, that's not my forte. I'm here representing the agency, but I do the regulatory aspect and not the finance project part. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to provide a cohesive answer on that, but we can certainly circle back to you.
I was curious, but I wasn't going to ask this. Why is the director not here?
My understanding is the director, the requirement for us to come and testify was a last minute decision, and the director had already planned to be away at another conference with another one of our deputy directors, which is why Mr. Brantley and I were asked to appear on the behalf of the agency.
I love having you here, but I've got to make some determinations about the bill following this hearing. For DCHA in 2023, Hamara Gabrias, you testified on behalf of DCHA that the agency would not be able to independently verify which apartments are rent stabilized until the rent registry comes online. Have you attended a demo session for the new database? And regardless, do you know whether the database will be sufficiently reliable for DCHA to determine which units are subject to rent control?
Good afternoon. Yes, I did attend some of the information sessions. I've looked on the website now, and I am not able to, I think some of the website is set up so that you could actually pull information, but more of that public information, it does not appear to be enabled at this moment. So I'm not able.
Done a demo?
Have
you done a demo?
It was a demo for the landlords as the database was being launched. So for small landlords, there was one for larger landlords about how they can input information into the system. But as far as how we're able to, as public, or have some other mechanism to pull information out, was not part of the demonstration.
Okay. Do you have concerns remaining about when this bill would apply and whether DCHA would know when this bill applies?
I think we just need to really, connect with DHCD to understand how and where the information would be available, and kind of talk through, I think you've heard the different testimonies about some of the, how the two programs may overlay and how we'd be able to get information. So I think we would need some further conversation around that before we could provide a response.
Okay, this is the conversation. This bill did not sneak
a
up
system,
on anybody.
a system,
The hearing
like
did
a
not sneak
system
up on
to
anybody.
system, right? No, a system to system conversation with DHCD.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to wrap up in a second. When does the record for this hearing close?
November 12th.
November 12th. Okay. Ms. Pear, let me just add the follow-up questions before I turn to my colleagues. So in addition to whether DHCD believes that some landlords are seeking only or mostly tenants with vouchers, I'd like to know if the agency supports this practice, approximately how long, if you've known, and what the agency recommends, if not this bill, on that issue.
I don't have.
That as a follow-up. I'm just saying, so I'm saying,
Thank
I just want to just add that so that we're clear.
Excellent.
Several questions.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pear, you know how much I always love seeing you. And I always ask the same questions. You alluded to it on the rent registry. It's open, it's being populated, the deadline, the 180 days has not run. Do you have a sense of what percentage of the units have had data that has already been uploaded?
I can't give you in terms of a percentage, but I can give you some raw numbers if you find that helpful.
That would be helpful.
I figured you were going to ask, because I know this is your passion. So, I mean, in terms of the percentages, just let me preface that by saying, we don't know the total universe of buildings, of rental buildings in the city. So, we have some records we can compare to, but this is really it. This is establishing our baseline. So, in terms of registrations, we have almost 10,000 there are almost 10,000 buildings that are, or 10,000 filings that have been submitting, units, I should say, that have to, there are 10,000 filings, let me put it that way. Out of those.
Giant difference, because
Yes,
there's like
it is.
200,000 units.
Right.
10,000 filings might be, how many units?
99,600 rental units.
Okay, that
Yeah.
helps.
But out of that, from that, we're almost 10,000 filings. So some are 1 unit, some are 400 units, right?
And so we have some time that we'll see how full it gets, because this database is a critical database for lots of different reasons. I got a little bit lost. If a unit is is exempt from rent stabilization because it's paid for through a voucher, will the rent show up in the rent registry?
No, it won't, because right now, the way, so the legislative intent from 45 years ago or 40 years ago, when it was designed, as my understanding is that the exemptions are for when there's an affordability model in place. And so it's not an overlap of 2 different types of affordability.
Yeah, I hear you, but I just want to be crystal clear just how frustrating I find that, because I think that's hiding the ball on this very issue of to what extent are we overpaying in this context. And I expected the rent registry to tell me what the rents were for every single unit. And you're telling me when I look at a building, if a third of it is paid for by vouchers, the rent field for that unit will be blank.
No, I didn't quite say that. So because of the legislative amendment that was passed in June, one of the things that all housing providers are entering at this point in the rent registry is it's a limited, but it's a rent history, right? It's giving us on every single unit, irrespective of whether it's exempt or in rent stabilized, the current monthly rent and the rent for the past 2 years. So we will have a little
Okay,
bit of
well,
rent
that was
history.
my question. Well, would the rent be there?
Sorry, I
And
misunderstood.
first you said no, but now you're saying yes. So
No,
that's
I was
very
saying no because I was focused on the exemption part where we,
But
we
My
have.
question was about will the rent be there? So once we
Yes.
have that, we will be able to look at that, and we'll be able to look at what this means as a numbers issue.
Yeah.
You talked in your testimony, I mean, there's a little bit about your testimony to me that feels like, and another thing. I mean, the chairman just asked about LIHTC and Housing Production Trust Fund, which you raised as a concern here, but it's not touched by this. So your answer to the chairman was, I don't know, but your testimony was this is going to have a negative impact on the production, and it isn't. So, we got to be real on this. You also said that this would reduce affordability, but it isn't changing the units. It's preserving rent stabilized units. It's not creating new ones. It's preserving ones that are there. And then it goes to what's the appropriate rent that the city should be paying for that unit. And so the idea this is eroding affordability in the district, I don't see on what basis you make that claim. On what basis do you make that claim? If the question is whether this unit would be subject to rent stabilization or not, how does subjecting a unit to rent stabilization reduce affordability in the district?
Well, I mean, if the whole premise of having an exemption based on, or giving an exemption because there's another affordability program in place with different standards, and supplanting that or replacing it with rent stabilization, then it's like we're overlaying two regulatory programs.
We are overlaying two regulatory programs now. We have buildings, and we've had landlords here who have a building that's half voucher and half rent stabilized.
Yes.
And the rents that they get, I mean, this gets into a question of fact that you actually should be the one with the most expertise. How do those rents differ? But it's not, there's the same number of units. It's a question of how they're being paid for and at what level they're being paid for. So to dress it up as this is a reduction in affordability, I just think it is not accurate. I mean, I think there is a legitimate discussion about what's an appropriate level of rent to be paying. Might there be extra costs in the setting of voucher tenants with high needs? How do we deal with that? But to act as if requiring the rent to be at the rent stabilized rent is somehow undermining the whole housing infrastructure is just inflammatory and not right. And I think the work you're doing is really important. I think the most important thing that you said is, can we talk? Let's talk about how this can work with the rent registry, but let's not treat it like it's the end of the world as we know it, because it is not. And there are genuine conversations about what's fair in this context. And let's be partners on that. Let's not be inflammatory on it.
Understood.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Nadeau.
Thank you so much, Chairman, for holding this hearing. I'm here actually to talk about the Home Purchase Assistance for Transit Workers Amendment Act of 2025. So my questions, I believe, are for Mr. Brantley. Mr. Brantley, how many DC government employees is the program currently available to EAP?
It's available to every DC government employee.
Do we know how many that is?
I don't know how many city employees there are, but
It's okay. How many applications did the EAP program receive in FY25?
EHAP received a total of 308. Now that's a combination of HPAP, EHAP, because about 80 to 85% of people that get EHAP also get HPAP.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And did the program exhaust its funding in FY25?
It did. We had some dollars left over from the EHAP that we reprogrammed into HPAP to facilitate those closings.
Okay. And when in the fiscal year did EHAP exhaust its funds?
Well, when we reprogrammed it, it was, I'd say July, August.
That was to facilitate closing for government employees that needed both?
Yes.
Okay. Did any of those reprogram funds go to non-government employees?
No.
Okay. And how much funding did the program, does the program have for FY26?
2.6 million, which is half of what it was prior year.
And why have transit employees not previously been eligible for the program?
Transit employees are not necessarily considered government employees of the city.
What discussions have you had with WMATA about how this program would be administered?
We have not had any discussions.
Okay. Do you think there is a potential to negotiate a cost-sharing agreement with WMATA?
When you say cost sharing, from what perspective?
That they would also contribute?
That would be, I mean, that would be something that we would certainly want to entertain.
So the bill was introduced when we were in the midst of discussing the transition of workers when the circulator was shut down, which we're now about to face again with the DC streetcar. And I think it's critical that we do right by these workers and retain them as transit operators in the district if they wish, especially given that WMATA still has operator shortages. How could assistance play a role in retaining that workforce?
Well, I think it would help them in terms of being able to live in the city. I think a lot of them live in just different jurisdictions. I think in my testimony, I mentioned that the bulk of them live in Maryland and Virginia. So the ones that work in DC would benefit by being able to purchase here.
And why are you proposing this be implemented as a 2-year pilot?
I think 2 years would give us time to really assess the viability, get a gauge on the demand for it from the WMATA employees, and also see what type of impact it has from a budget standpoint.
You've mentioned that you've regularly reprogrammed money from EHAP. Records show that it's often had underspending of close to $2 million per year. Why are all those funds not being spent given the size of the eligible workforce?
Well, again, I'm not sure what you're referencing or seeing, but we've reprogrammed certainly last year the excess in order to facilitate closings for HPAP. I think in 2023 there was an increase in the loan amount up to $202,000, which again put a lot of demand on the budget from that standpoint. So the excess funds were reprogrammed into HPAP.
So each of the last 4 years, 2022 to 2025 fiscal years, were reprogrammed to HPAP?
I know those 2 years were. I'd have to check on the other ones in terms of the other years.
Yeah. I know you don't think of it as underspending because it's going to the employee through the HPAP bucket. Would those employees not be able to make the purchase if it wasn't reprogrammed to HPAP?
In a lot of those cases, that would be the case.
Because they need both, but HPAP is depleted.
They need both, yes.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Nadeau. For Ms. Gabrias, would you expect anything about the housing landscape to change for voucher holders if we passed this bill?
I think we've heard some of the concerns that have been raised about the potential delays and the impacts to landlords. The discussion around yes, it is a discrimination against source of income is against the law, but those concerns are also ones that we have heard. So getting a better understanding of how the two systems would actually, if we're talking about implementation, what that impact, the timeline that it would take, I think would be, would help us to understand, based on our system and our processes and how, with the rent administration, like how that would then play out would be, we'd be able to better understand the impacts on timeline.
Okay. I mean, I do have some concerns that this would make it more difficult for people with vouchers. But the other side of that is, and I'd say it's one of the strong arguments in favor of this bill, is that it would save DCHA money and let you stretch your voucher dollars further, which would mean you could assist more people. So how do you look at that balance?
I think the being good stewards of the limited resources is definitely something that we are, is a priority for the Housing Authority, and some of the things that we've implemented in terms of the rent reasonableness process and expedite and making sure that we are processing timely are things that we are trying to do. If we are able to, the more families we're able to serve, I think the better. So I think there are many ways that we can work on how we can do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we would preclude any of those. Doing some doesn't mean we don't do the other. So I applaud the work that the agency has done. Are you aware of examples from other jurisdictions where they've made this kind of policy transition, moving voucher payments from the market level to the rent control level?
I know our team is actually doing outreach to other jurisdictions but I don't think we found an example that's quite comparable, but we are searching.
Mr. Brantley, I just want to make sure I'm clear in your testimony. All of the reprogrammings from EHAP last fiscal year were for DC government employees who were using HPAP?
Yeah, I believe the overwhelming majority was for DC government employees, about 95%.
Okay. There is still, though, at minimum of $1.6 million in excess funds since 2022. So I'm looking at the past 4 fiscal years, and the low mark is 1.63 million, high mark is 3.5 million, which was fiscal year 2024. But you're recommending a pilot project so we can see how it works and interacts with other programs.
Correct.
Okay. There was one concern that I couldn't understand that DHCD flagged around this proposal, that it could raise administrative costs because of the CBOs might need to host more housing counseling service sessions if more applicants apply for EHAP. But I think those sessions are typically virtual and don't have a cap on the number of people that attend. Am I missing something?
I believe those are one-on-one sessions because of the confidential nature of sharing information in terms of income and financial information. And from our perspective, it takes about 5 or 6 sessions for individuals to go through the counseling, the budgeting, the housing, all of that. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I will just round out by saying on Councilmember Fruman's bill, the time to talk is still here, but it is finite. This issue isn't new. When we get responses from DHED on whether they are aware of overconcentration in buildings, my guess is that the answer is going to be yes, because I've been copied on those for quite some time. Now, DHCD may argue that they don't believe it's an issue, in which case I'd be curious to understand that. But if you do believe it's an issue, then the question is, what do we do? Councilmember Fruman is willing to be a partner in that. I'm willing to be a partner in that. We have some landlords who said, hey, we're one of the good guys. We don't want to get swept up. And so, we're willing to get that insight. I don't think we have a choice to not do anything. But I don't think, this committee, and certainly I don't think Councilmember Fruman is trying to hurt the bad folks. So the question is, how do we get on the same page? And so I'm eager to see how we do that, and we'll get some follow-up responses after this hearing. So thank you both for being with us, Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you very much, Chairman White, and I really appreciate you having this hearing. I appreciate the spirit that you brought to this hearing. I appreciate the way you just talked about it now, which is we can't do nothing. We need to address these issues. But I also don't want to pretend I have all of the answers. And I think we can all benefit from sitting down dispassionately and talking through how we can address some of the issues that have been raised. I think they are solvable. I think we tried to solve them between the first version of the bill and the second version of the bill, but let's take a little bit of time, not a ton of time. I appreciate that, Chairman White, and I appreciate you imposing that discipline on us to figure out what's real and what's not real about the concerns and how it is that we can address this so that we don't incentivize overconcentration, so that we do use our tax dollars as efficiently as possible, and are able to serve that many more people. And so that we have something that is fair to everybody involved. We can do it. I don't think we're that far away. Let's spend a little bit of time in the coming weeks to have those conversations and get to something that everybody can get behind. So thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you to the other witnesses for your testimony, and look forward to an ongoing conversation that doesn't last forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fruman. And thank you to all of our public witnesses and to our government witnesses as well. For anyone who was unable to testify today, written testimony is encouraged and will be made part of the official record. Anyone who is interested may submit additional testimony through the dedicated webpage for this hearing on the council's online hearing management system. And if you don't know where to find that, you can contact the Committee on Housing at housing@dccouncil.gov or call us at 202-727-8270. The record for this hearing will remain open until the close of business 2 weeks from today on Tuesday, November 12th. If anyone listening is interested in learning more about the work of this committee or my office, please sign up to hear from us at robertwhiteatlarge.com. That concludes the committee's business for today. The time is 3:04 p.m. and this hearing is adjourned.